My wife was in our bed with her rich CEO. I caught them when I came home early from work trip. He saw me and smirked triumphantly until I told him, "I just sent your wife a video of you too." He was frantic in anger since his wife was. My name is Jude Carter, and I'm about to tell you how my perfectly ordinary Tuesday turned into the kind of train wreck that makes you wonder if God's got a twisted sense of humor or just really bad timing. See, I'd been in Dallas for 3 days, sitting through mind-numbing presentations about quarterly projections and synergistic solutions. Corporate speak that basically translates to, "We have no clue what we're doing, but let's use fancy words." The conference wrapped up early, which should have been my first red flag. Good things happening to me? Yeah, that's usually when life decides to drop-kick me in the teeth. But hey, I was feeling optimistic for once. Maybe even a little proud of myself for thinking ahead. I'd already planned my grand romantic gesture. Swing by Mrs. Petrov's corner flower shop, grab some of those roses Sienna always goes nuts for, and surprise my wife with an early homecoming. You know, the kind of cheesy move that works in rom-coms, but probably makes real women roll their eyes. Still, I figured I'd earn some husband points after being gone for 3 days of essential business development. Translation: I sat in hotel conference rooms eating stale bagels and pretending to care about market penetration strategies. The cab ride from the airport was classic Austin weird. Tund, my driver, spent the entire 20-minute trip bragging about his niece making varsity volleyball, showing me grainy photos on his cracked phone screen while weaving through traffic like he was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Soccer Dad Edition. She got the height from her mama's side, he kept saying. But the killer instinct? That's pure Tund genetics right there. I nodded and made appropriate impressed noises because, honestly, the guy's enthusiasm was infectious. Plus, after 3 days of corporate zombies, hearing someone genuinely excited about family felt refreshing as hell. Our little Austin bungalow looked picture-perfect from the street, just like always. The oak tree we planted when we first moved in was doing its thing, the porch light was on, and everything screamed, "Welcome home, devoted husband." I should have known something was off right then and there. In my experience, when things look too perfect, it's usually because someone's working overtime to make sure you don't peek behind the curtain. But I was riding high on my surprise homecoming plan, clutching those roses like they were going to solve all our recent, let's call them communication issues. The front door unlocked with its usual sticky protest, and I stepped inside expecting the familiar smell of Sienna's vanilla candles and maybe some leftover takeout. Instead, the air felt wrong, thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a Texas thunderstorm. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and your gut immediately starts sending up flare signals? Yeah, that was happening in stereo. But my brain, being the optimistic idiot it apparently is, decided to override my instincts. Maybe she was upstairs taking a bath. Maybe she'd be thrilled to see me early. Maybe I was just paranoid from too much airport coffee and conference room fluorescent lighting. Then I saw it. Draped over our living room chair like it owned the place was a suit jacket I'd never seen before in my life. And not just any jacket. This thing was clearly expensive, the kind of tailored perfection that screams, "I make more in a month than you make in a year." Hand-stitched initials on the inside pocket caught my eye, AV. My stomach dropped faster than a lead balloon, but I kept moving, kept climbing those stairs with my suitcase in one hand and those suddenly ridiculous roses in the other. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk right back out that door, and pretend I'd never seen the jacket. Just get back in a cab, fly back to Dallas, and live in blissful ignorance for a few more hours. But the other part, the part that apparently hates me, needed to know. Needed to see exactly how spectacular this disaster was going to be. I reached our bedroom door, and for a split second, I hesitated. This was it. The moment that was going to divide my life into before and after. I could hear movement inside, low voices, the kind of sounds that make your blood turn to ice water. My hand was shaking as I turned that doorknob, and I swear I could feel my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. And there they were. My wife, Sienna Hale, in our bed, our goddamn bed. With Adrian Voss, the smug CEO of Voss Dynamics. The same Adrian Voss who'd been her boss for the past 2 years. The same Adrian Voss whose company Christmas parties I'd attended, making small talk about quarterly earnings while he probably laughed at me behind my back. He glanced over his shoulder when I walked in, and I swear to God, the bastard had the audacity to smirk. Not embarrassed, not apologetic. He looked at me like he'd already won some game I didn't even know we were playing. Now, here's where most people expect the wronged husband to lose his shit, start screaming, maybe throw a few punches. But sometimes, when life hits you with something so monumentally screwed up, your brain just goes into this weird calm mode. Like you're watching it happen to someone else on TV. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and very calmly said, "I just sent your wife a video of you two." Watching Adrian's face drain of color was almost worth the price of admission. Almost. His phone started buzzing immediately, and in his panic to answer it, the idiot hit speaker by mistake. Marina Voss's voice filled our bedroom, cold, sharp, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled fury. "What am I looking at, Adrian?" 6 words that sliced through the room like a chainsaw through butter. Adrian started stammering some bullshit explanation, but Marina cut him off with surgical precision. "Don't come home." Then the line went dead, leaving us all standing there in the aftermath of what I was pretty sure was the most expensive divorce in Austin history. I looked at Adrian, still naked and now sweating bullets, and told him to get out of my house. Not yelling, not threatening, just stating a fact. He scrambled for his clothes like the place was on fire, which, metaphorically speaking, it was. Sienna whispered my name, soft and broken, like she was trying out some magic word that would undo the last 10 minutes. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because honestly, what the hell was I supposed to say to that? So there I was, sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at that wall clock like it held the secrets of the universe. Tick, 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 each second stretching out like taffy, reminding me that time keeps moving even when your world just got body slammed into next week. The house felt different now, like the walls themselves were judging me for being such a clueless idiot. How long had this been going on? How many signs had I missed while I was busy being the devoted husband, bringing home flowers, and actually believing my wife when she said she was working late again? My brain started doing that thing where it rewinds the highlight reel of your stupidity in high definition. Those strategy dinners that somehow always ran until midnight. Yeah, real strategic, Jude. The way Sienna suddenly became Fort Knox with her phone, flipping it face down whenever I walked into a room like she was guarding nuclear launch codes instead of probably sexting her boss. And Jesus, the jewelry. That tennis bracelet she claimed was from the team for hitting some quarterly target. I'd actually been proud of her, thinking she was finally getting the recognition she deserved. Turns out the only thing she was hitting was Adrian Voss, and the bracelet was probably his way of saying thanks for services rendered. The coffee maker gurgled to life because apparently my hands had decided to function even though my brain was still processing the fact that my marriage had just exploded like a meth lab. I stood there watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, thinking about how even this simple morning ritual felt different now. Everything was different now. The kitchen table where we'd eaten breakfast together for 5 years, the refrigerator covered in photos of us looking happy and clueless, the stupid ceramic owl salt shaker Sienna bought at some craft fair because she thought it was quirky. All of it was just props in a play I didn't know I was starring in. But sitting there marinating in my own misery wasn't going to solve anything, and honestly, the longer I stayed in that house, the more I felt like I was suffocating in the ghost of my own ignorance. So I did what any rational person would do when their life implodes. I got in my car and drove to confront the other victim in this soap opera disaster. Because if I was going down, I sure as hell wasn't going down alone. Marina Voss lived in one of those pristine townhouses in Tarrytown that screams, "I have money and excellent taste, and I will destroy you with both." The kind of place where the landscaping probably costs more than most people's cars and the doormat is worth more than my monthly mortgage payment. I sat in my car for about 10 minutes, working up the nerve to ring the doorbell, wondering if she already knew what had happened or if I was about to be the bearer of the world's shittiest news. When she opened the door, Marina Voss looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who could probably buy and sell half of Austin without breaking a sweat. Blazer that probably cost more than my car, hair that defied gravity and physics, and eyes that could cut glass. But here's the thing. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked like she'd been expecting this visit, which either meant she had psychic powers or Adrian was even dumber than I'd given him credit for. Mr. Carter, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Not a question, not a greeting, just a statement of fact, like she was checking my name off some invisible list. Her townhouse was everything mine wasn't. Clean lines, expensive everything, and the kind of silence that comes from having enough money to soundproof your life. She led me to her kitchen, which looked like something out of Architectural Digest. All marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that probably had more computing power than NASA. The coffee she made tasted like it cost $50 a cup, rich and smooth, and completely at odds with the fact that we were two strangers whose spouses had just nuked both our lives from orbit. We sat across from each other at her kitchen island, and I swear the marble felt cold enough to freeze my soul, which was probably appropriate given the circumstances. So, Marina said, wrapping her hands around her cup like it was a weapon she was getting ready to wield. How long do you think this has been going on? Straight to the point, no small talk, no pretending this was some social visit. I like that about her already. No bullshit, just business. We started trading information like we were conducting some kind of forensic investigation, which I guess we were. She pulled out her phone and showed me Adrian's calendar. All those client meetings and off-site strategy sessions that lined up perfectly with Sienna's mysterious late nights. I showed her the credit card statements I'd been too trusting to question before. Charges at hotels I'd never heard of, expensive restaurants where apparently my wife was whining and dining herself with my money while screwing her boss. Marina had receipts, literally. Gift purchases that didn't make it home to her, weekend trips to Lake Travis that were supposedly team-building exercises, and a paper trail that painted a picture of two people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. The timeline we constructed was depressingly clear. This thing had been going on for at least 6 months, maybe longer. 6 months of me bringing home flowers while my wife was getting her flowers from someone else, if you catch my drift. But here's what impressed me about Marina Voss. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't doing any of the things you'd expect from someone whose husband just got caught with his pants down. She was calculating, methodical, like she was planning a hostile takeover instead of a divorce. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgeon's hand, and every word felt deliberate. I don't believe in screaming matches, she said, refilling our coffee cups with the precision of someone who'd probably never had a hair out of place in her entire life. They're messy, they're undignified, and most importantly, they don't accomplish anything except making you look unstable in court. The way she said court made it sound like she was already 3 moves ahead in a chess game I was just learning to play. We made a pact right there in her pristine kitchen, sealed with expensive coffee and mutual betrayal. No public scenes, no social media drama, no burning down their offices in fits of rage, just cold, calculated consequences delivered with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. She handed me a business card for Amara Quinn, a divorce attorney who, according to Marina, doesn't believe in friendly fire. She's expensive, Marina warned, but she's worth every penny. And Jude. She looked at me with those laser-focused eyes. Don't let them think they can manage this. They made their choice. Now we make ours. Let me tell you something about divorce lawyers. They're like sharks, but with better suits and hourly rates that could finance a small country's GDP. When I walked into the offices of Quinn, Sato, and Brandt, I felt like I was entering some kind of legal fortress where dreams go to die and bank accounts get systematically dismantled. The reception area screamed, "We will destroy your enemies, but it's going to cost you." With its polished hardwood floors, leather furniture that probably cost more than my car, and abstract art that looked like someone threw paint at a canvas and called it a day. Amara Quinn turned out to be exactly what Marina had promised, a legal predator disguised as a professional woman in a power suit that could probably stop bullets. Her handshake was firm enough to crack walnuts, and when she looked at me, I got the distinct impression she was already calculating how many ways she could eviscerate the opposition. Her office was all sharp angles and intimidating law books, the kind of place where justice gets served with a side of financial ruin for whoever's stupid enough to cross her. "So," she said, settling behind her desk like a general preparing for war, "Marina tells me you've got a cheating spouse situation with some interesting complications." The way she said "interesting complications" made it sound like she was ordering her favorite dish at a restaurant. Let's start with the basics. Any kids? When I shook my head, She made a note that probably said something like, "No custody battle to complicate the carnage." Shared home. Another note. "Any prenup?" When I said no to that one, I swear I saw her eyes light up like a kid on Christmas morning. Her questions were simple, direct, and designed to strip away all the emotional bullshit and get down to what really mattered: money, assets, and how much damage we could legally inflict on the people who'd screwed us over. She didn't ask how I felt about it, didn't offer tissues or sympathetic looks. This wasn't therapy. This was warfare with filing fees. I handed over the video that had already destroyed Adrian's marriage, along with a thumb drive containing every text message, email, and credit card statement I could get my hands on. Watching her review the evidence was like watching a master chef examine ingredients. She knew exactly what she was working with and how to turn it into something that would leave the opposition begging for mercy. "This is good," she said, which in lawyer speak probably translated to, "We're about to make these idiots wish they'd never been born." Texas isn't a no-fault state, despite what a lot of people think. Adultery matters here, and you've got documentation that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. She buzzed her assistant, and within minutes, 2 more people appeared in her office like legal reinforcements. Kira, her paralegal, looked like she could organize a military invasion and still have time for a coffee break. She immediately started pulling together a document list that would apparently require more paperwork than buying a house, selling a house, and financing a small business all at the same time. Leo Park, one of the associates, looked fresh out of law school but had the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd been born to make other people's lives miserable through the creative application of legal statutes. While they worked, Amara explained Texas divorce law like she was teaching a masterclass in legal destruction. "Fault doesn't control everything," she said, "but it sure as hell influences property division, spousal support, and most importantly, leverage. When someone's caught with their pants down, literally, in this case, they tend to be a lot more reasonable about settlement negotiations." She leaned back in her chair, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she mapped out our strategy. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to secure your finances, change every password you've ever used, and move anything valuable to a safe place. You're also going to document everything. Every lie, every excuse, every time she comes home late smelling like expensive cologne. And most importantly, you're not going to do anything stupid at work." That last part hit me like a slap in the face. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "I mean, you're not going to confront Adrian Voss in his office. You're not going to send angry emails to the entire company. And you're not going to do anything that makes you look like the unhinged ex-husband," she said, fixing me with a stare that could have melted steel. "Steady wins, Jude. The person who keeps their cool while everyone else is losing their shit is the person who walks away with their dignity and their bank account intact." Leo handed me a stack of papers that looked thick enough to use as a doorstop. "Initial petition," he explained, "along with temporary restraining orders and financial disclosures. We'll have these filed by end of business today." The efficiency was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. While my personal life was imploding, at least the legal machinery was moving with clockwork precision. The retainer agreement made my credit card weep, but Marina had been right. You get what you pay for, and what I was paying for was the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Amara's firm didn't mess around, didn't pull punches, and didn't believe in giving the opposition any quarter. When I signed that agreement, I felt like I was enlisting in an army whose only mission was to make sure I came out of this disaster with my dignity and my assets intact. Walking out of that office building, I noticed something weird. The world was still there. I mean, obviously it was still there, but for the past 24 hours, it had felt like my personal apocalypse had somehow frozen everything else in place. But nope, Austin was still Austin. The heat was still making the asphalt shimmer like a mirage. There was still a guy playing violin by the taco stand on the corner, and the smell of fresh tortillas from the food truck was still making my stomach remind me that I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday's airplane peanuts. I bought 2 breakfast tacos from the food truck, chorizo and egg, because if you're going to eat your feelings, you might as well do it right, and sat on a bench watching people walk by with their normal problems and their normal lives. A jogger ran past, probably worried about her mile time. A businessman hurried by, checking his phone and probably stressing about some presentation. A mom pushed a stroller while talking on her phone about soccer practice schedules. All of them blissfully unaware that my marriage had just been officially declared dead and that somewhere across town, Adrian Voss was probably realizing that sleeping with his employee was about to cost him more money than a small country's annual budget. The strangest part was how normal it all felt, like the universe had just shrugged and moved on while I was still trying to process the fact that my entire life had been a lie. She was sitting at our kitchen table when I got home, wrapped around a coffee mug like it was a life preserver. The same table where we'd eaten countless breakfasts together, where she'd done her crosswords every Sunday morning, where I'd proposed to her 3 years ago like some romantic comedy cliché. Now it felt like a negotiation table in some corporate boardroom, complete with the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl and your fight-or-flight instincts start doing jumping jacks. Sienna looked like hell, which I have to admit gave me a tiny spark of satisfaction that I immediately felt guilty about. Her hair was doing that thing where it sticks up in the back when she's been running her hands through it. Her makeup was smeared like she'd been crying for hours, and she was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Good. At least one of us looked like their world had just been nuked from orbit. "We need to talk," she said without looking up from her mug. And I almost laughed because really? Now she wanted to talk? After 6 months of sneaking around behind my back, after turning our bedroom into her personal adultery headquarters, after making me look like the world's biggest fool? But I didn't laugh because honestly, I was curious to see what kind of Hail Mary bullshit she was going to try to pull out of her ass. I sat down across from her, keeping the table between us like a demilitarized zone, and waited. The silence stretched out like taffy until she finally looked up with those big brown eyes that used to make me forget my own name. Now they just reminded me of how stupid I'd been to trust someone who could lie as easily as breathing. "The papers will be served by Friday," I said, because I figured I might as well cut through whatever performance she was preparing. Her face crumpled like I'd just told her Santa Claus was dead, and the tears started flowing like someone had turned on a faucet. "Jude, please," she started, and here it came, the greatest hits album of cheating spouse excuses. It was a mistake. I was under so much pressure at work, and Adrian was there, and I felt so invisible in our marriage. She was hitting all the classics. The vulnerable woman, the manipulative boss, the neglectful husband who somehow drove her into another man's arms in bed. I let her talk because honestly, I was fascinated by the sheer audacity of it all. She was sitting there trying to rewrite history like I was some kind of idiot who'd just fallen off the turnip truck. According to her revised version of events, I was the villain who'd somehow forced her to cheat by being. What exactly? Too busy with work? Not psychic enough to read her mind? Too trusting to assume my wife wasn't screwing her boss in our bed while I was out of town? When she finally ran out of steam, I pointed upstairs toward our bedroom, the scene of the crime, so to speak. "There is no we to fix," I said, making sure to speak slowly so every word would sink in. "There's me, there's you, and there's the fact that you chose to blow up our marriage for whatever this thing with Adrian was supposed to be." She tried the counseling angle next, which was rich coming from someone who'd been counseling Adrian Voss right out of his pants for the better part of 6 months. "We could try therapy," she said, like our problems were some kind of communication issue that could be solved with a few sessions and some relationship workbooks. "We could work through this together." "No," I said, and the word felt good in my mouth. Clean, simple, final. Then she asked for time, like time was some magical healing potion that would somehow make me forget about finding her naked with her boss in our bed. "Just give me a week," she pleaded, "to show you that I can change, that this doesn't have to be the end of everything." "No," I said again, and this time it felt even better. Finally, she went for broke and asked for just 1 week, not to fix things, but to figure out how to move forward without destroying each other. Which was hilarious because, honey, the destruction had already happened. She'd taken care of that part when she decided our marriage vows were more like guidelines than actual commitments. "No," I said for the 3rd time, and I swear I could see something die in her eyes. The hope, maybe, or the delusion that she could somehow talk her way out of the consequences of her choices. She nodded like she understood, but I could tell she didn't really get it. She was still thinking like someone who believed that explanations could undo actions, that the right combination of words could somehow rewind time and make yesterday's disaster disappear. But that's not how life works, and it's definitely not how adultery works. She went upstairs to pack, and I have to give her credit. She was efficient. 20 minutes later, she came back down with 2 suitcases and a look on her face like she was heading to a funeral. Which, in a way, I guess she was. The funeral of our marriage, officiated by her own spectacularly bad decisions. At the door, she tried to give some kind of goodbye speech, probably something she'd been rehearsing in her head while she packed. But I raised my hand like a traffic cop, because honestly, what was there left to say? Sorry. She'd already said that. Goodbye? The situation spoke for itself. I love you. Those words had lost all meaning the moment she decided to share our bed with someone else. The door closed with a soft click, and just like that, 5 years of marriage was reduced to the sound of a latch catching. I stood there for a moment, half expecting to feel something dramatic. Relief, anger, crushing sadness, maybe all 3 at once. Instead, I felt oddly empty, like someone had scooped out all my emotions with a melon baller and left me running on nothing but autopilot. Mr. Whitmore, our 70-something neighbor, was doing some aggressive rose trimming in his front yard, which was his polite way of keeping an eye on the drama unfolding next door. When our eyes met across the fence, he gave me a small nod. Not sympathy, not pity, just acknowledgement from one man to another. He didn't say a word, didn't offer any platitudes about how things would get better or how I was better off without her. I was grateful for that silence. Sometimes the best thing someone can do is just witness your disaster without trying to fix it or explain it away. Mr. Whitmore got that. Bless his nosy old soul. He just kept trimming his roses and pretending he wasn't watching my marriage officially die in real time. While I was busy watching my marriage get carted away in a rolling suitcase, Marina Voss was apparently conducting her own version of shock and awe about 3 miles across town. See, here's what I learned about Marina in the following weeks. When she said she didn't believe in screaming matches, what she really meant was that she believed in something far more terrifying. Systematic destruction delivered with the precision of a Swiss watch and the brutality of a medieval siege engine. Her lawyer, Victor Lang, turned out to be the kind of guy who probably ate opposing counsel for breakfast and used their tears as coffee creamer. Within 48 hours of our kitchen summit, he'd filed motions that would make a tax auditor weep with admiration. Asset freeze? Check. Expense trail subpoenas? Double check. Emergency orders that basically turned Adrian's financial life into a glass house, where everyone could see exactly how he'd been spending his money. Triple check with a cherry on top. The beautiful thing about rich people is that they always leave paper trails, because when you're used to buying your way out of problems, you tend to forget that credit cards are basically confession letters written in monthly installments. Victor's forensic accountant, a woman who probably got aroused by spreadsheets, started pulling apart Adrian's expenses like she was performing surgery on a budget. Hotel suites that were supposedly for client entertainment, but coincidentally happened on nights when Sienna was working late. Business gifts that turned out to be diamond earrings and designer handbags. A weekend at Lake Travis that was billed as executive team building, but seemed to have involved exactly 2 executives building something that definitely wasn't corporate synergy. Meanwhile, at Voss Dynamics, the dominoes were starting to fall like it was some kind of corporate Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone with a really twisted sense of justice. The company's internal audit department, those fun-loving folks who normally spent their days making sure people weren't stealing office supplies, suddenly found themselves investigating whether their CEO had been violating about 17 different sections of the employee handbook. Here's the thing about corporate America. Companies will tolerate a lot of crap from their executives. Cocaine habit? We'll send you to rehab. Embezzlement? We'll work out a payment plan. But screwing your employees while potentially exposing the company to sexual harassment lawsuits? That's when the corporate lawyers start sharpening their knives and the HR department starts updating their LinkedIn profiles. Adrian's legendary charm, which had apparently been working overtime to convince everyone that he was just a misunderstood visionary with a healthy appreciation for team building, suddenly stopped being quite so charming when it was being examined under the fluorescent lights of a conference room full of employment attorneys. Turns out that charisma doesn't translate well to incident reports and sworn depositions. The board chair, Avery Chun, a woman who looked like she could reduce grown men to tears just by adjusting her reading glasses, started asking the kind of questions that make CEOs break out in cold sweats. Questions like, how exactly do you define client entertainment in this context? And can you explain why this employee received performance bonuses that were significantly higher than her productivity metrics would justify? The kind of questions that don't have good answers when you've been thinking with your pants instead of your brain for the past 6 months. Meanwhile, in the legal system, Judge Elkins was signing off on Marina's initial orders like he was autographing baseballs, and Amara Quinn was filing my petition with the kind of professional satisfaction that probably came from knowing she was about to make someone very, very sorry they'd ever heard the word adultery. The beautiful thing about Texas divorce law is that it's not nearly as forgiving as some people think, especially when you've got video evidence and a paper trail that reads like a how-to guide for corporate sexual harassment. Adrian, bless his narcissistic little heart, tried to ride this out like it was just another business crisis that could be managed with the right PR firm and maybe a strategic donation to charity. He moved into some ridiculous luxury rental that probably cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. The kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Austin skyline that was supposed to make you feel like a master of the universe. Instead, it just made him look like a guy who was hemorrhaging money while his life fell apart in real time. But here's where the whole great love affair narrative started falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Turns out that sneaking around behind your spouse's backs is a lot more romantic than actually having to deal with each other in the harsh light of day. Sienna, who'd been couch surfing with various coworkers like some kind of corporate nomad, finally landed in a month-to-month studio apartment above a bar that apparently never heard of the concept of quiet hours. Nothing kills romance quite like having to split the cost of groceries and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash. Especially when you're both suddenly dealing with lawyers who charge more per hour than most people make in a week, and the realization that following your heart doesn't come with dental benefits or a 401k match. The cracks started showing pretty quickly. Jealous text messages about who Adrian was talking to at work functions. Arguments about money that escalated from whispered disagreements to full-blown shouting matches. Sienna apparently had some unrealistic expectations about what life with a disgrace-o was going to look like, while Adrian was discovering that maintaining 2 households and paying 2 sets of divorce attorneys was putting a serious dent in his master of the universe budget. The whole thing came to a head in a Whole Foods parking garage, because of course it did, because even their breakdowns had to be embarrassingly Austin, where they had a screaming match that ended with Adrian throwing Sienna's phone against a concrete pillar. Witnesses reported that the conversation involved a lot of words that probably aren't typically heard in the organic produce section, along with some accusations about financial responsibility and emotional availability that suggested their great love was more like great mutual self-destruction. The shattered phone became a perfect metaphor for their relationship: expensive, broken, and ultimately replaceable. Adrian stormed off in his BMW, probably muttering about ungrateful women and the unfairness of it all, while Sienna was left standing there surrounded by the scattered pieces of her device and, presumably, her illusions about what kind of life she'd thought she was signing up for. From my perspective, watching this unfold was like being a spectator at the world's most expensive train wreck. These were 2 people who'd blown up for lives because they thought they were smarter than everyone else, only to discover that infidelity is actually just another word for stupidity with better marketing. You know what they say about burning bridges? Sometimes you don't burn them. Sometimes you load them onto a truck and haul them to the city dump to watch industrial equipment turn them into compressed metal cubes. That's exactly what I did with our bedroom. And let me tell you, there's something deeply therapeutic about watching a garbage compactor swallow the bed where your wife screwed her boss. It's like closure, but with hydraulics and the satisfying crunch of particle board getting turned into recyclable materials. The whole mattress disposal adventure started about a week after Sienna moved out, when I realized I couldn't sleep in that room anymore without feeling like I was camping at the scene of a crime. Every time I looked at that bed, my brain helpfully supplied a high-definition replay of walking in on them, complete with surround sound and smell-o-vision. So I did what any rational person would do when faced with furniture that had been contaminated by infidelity. I rented a pickup truck and turned the whole thing into a one-man demolition project. Getting a king-size mattress and box spring down the stairs by yourself is basically like trying to wrestle an octopus made of fabric and springs, but I was running on pure spite and the kind of adrenaline that comes from finally doing something constructive with your rage. The bed frame came apart easier than my marriage had, which seemed fitting in a way that probably would have been poetic if I was the kind of guy who gave a shit about poetry right then. The dump was one of those places that makes you appreciate the simple beauty of industrial efficiency. Guys in hard hats operating machinery that could crush a car into a lunchbox. Mountains of discarded furniture and appliances that represented thousands of other people's life changes and fresh starts. When I watched that compactor grab my marital bed and turn it into something that looked like abstract art made of springs and regret, I felt lighter than I had in months. But destroying the evidence was only step one. Step two involved calling Gwen's crew, a bunch of guys who could make any room look like it belonged in a home improvement magazine, assuming you had the budget and the patience to let them work their magic. Gwen herself was this tiny woman who looked like she could bench press a refrigerator and probably had, judging by the way she sized up my bedroom like she was planning a military invasion. "You want to sand and refinish the whole floor?" she asked, running her hand across the hardwood like she was reading it for clues. "That's going to take about 3 days, and you're going to need somewhere else to sleep while we work." When I told her I'd been sleeping on the couch anyway, she just nodded like that made perfect sense, which I appreciated. No awkward questions about why a grown man was voluntarily camping out in his own living room. Watching them work was like seeing artists who specialized in erasing the past. The sanders stripped away years of scuff marks and scratches, along with whatever invisible traces of betrayal might have been soaked into the wood grain. The smell of sawdust and polyurethane was sharp and clean, nothing like the lingering cologne and lies that had been hanging in the air for months. While they worked on the floors, I went to Home Depot and spent about 3 hours staring at paint samples like they held the secrets of the universe. Sienna had always vetoed anything that wasn't some variation of beige or cream, claiming that neutral colors are timeless, and we want something that won't date the house. What she really meant was that she wanted something safe and boring, something that wouldn't offend potential buyers if we ever decided to sell. But we weren't selling anymore, and I wasn't interested in timeless. I was interested in mine. I picked a deep slate blue that looked like a thunderstorm, the kind of color that would make the room feel completely different from anything we'd shared. When I rolled that first stripe of paint onto the wall, it was like drawing a line between who I used to be and who I was becoming. Each stroke covered up not just the bland beige underneath, but 6 years of compromise and accommodation and pretending that neutral was the same thing as happy. The new bed was simple, just a heavy wooden frame that didn't squeak when you moved, didn't have any fancy headboard carved with flowers or other romantic bullshit, and came with a warranty that didn't depend on anyone else keeping their promises. I bought sheets that were soft and white and completely mine, pillows that had never supported anyone else's dreams or lies, and a comforter that would never need to be washed because someone else's perfume had gotten all over it. The first night I slept in that room after the renovation was like staying in a hotel that happened to be located in my own house. Everything was familiar but different, comfortable but not loaded with history. The walls were the color of deep water, the floors gleamed with fresh polyurethane, and the air smelled like new beginnings instead of old regrets. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. But the bedroom was just the beginning. I started making other changes, small ones that probably wouldn't mean anything to anyone else, but felt revolutionary to me. I left my shoes by the front door without listening for lectures about tracking dirt through the house. I ate cereal for dinner while watching SportsCenter, because apparently that's what happens when you don't have to negotiate every meal like it's a peace treaty between warring nations. The remote control lived permanently on my side of the couch, and I could watch entire games without someone asking questions about the rules or sighing dramatically about how boring football was. I played music without headphones, left dishes in the sink overnight without feeling guilty, and discovered that living alone didn't mean being lonely. It meant being free to be myself without having to explain or justify every choice to someone who'd apparently been planning their exit strategy anyway. My manager Omar Shah noticed the difference at work, which either meant I'd been more obviously miserable than I thought, or that divorce had given me some kind of professional superpower. During a client recap meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "You seem more focused lately, more engaged." He was right. Though I couldn't exactly explain that having your personal life explode had somehow made it easier to concentrate on quarterly projections and market analysis. The truth was, my mind felt clearer than it had in years. Without constantly worrying about whether Sienna was happy, whether I was doing enough, whether those late nights really were just about work, I could actually focus on the tasks in front of me. Problems that used to seem overwhelming suddenly looked manageable. Clients who used to intimidate me just looked like people who needed solutions I was perfectly capable of providing. It was like I'd been trying to solve math problems with half my brain tied behind my back, and suddenly someone had cut the ropes. The mental energy I'd been spending on denial and justification and trying to fix things that weren't actually broken was now available for more productive uses, like figuring out why our biggest account was hemorrhaging money and what we could do to stop the bleeding. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my life felt like it actually belonged to me. Turns out when you're not spending half your mental energy trying to decode whether your wife's working late again means she's actually working or just working on her boss's zipper, you discover you've got some serious untapped brain power just sitting around looking for something productive to do. Who knew? I sure as hell didn't. But apparently I'd been operating at about 60% capacity for months, maybe years, and suddenly having access to the full CPU was like upgrading from dial-up to fiber optic internet. Work stopped being this thing I did to pay bills and started being this thing I chose to engage with because, shock of all shocks, I was actually pretty good at it when I wasn't distracted by wondering why my wife had suddenly developed an allergic reaction to coming home before 10 p.m. Omar had been piling projects on my desk for years, probably because I was one of the few people who didn't immediately start whining about overtime or asking for additional resources every time something required actual effort. But now, instead of just grinding through assignments like I was serving time in a corporate prison, I started volunteering for the messy stuff. You know, the accounts that everyone else avoided because they were complicated or boring or involved clients who had the social skills of caffeinated badgers. There was this one account, Henderson Manufacturing, that had been bleeding money for 6 months and driving our entire team crazy because nobody could figure out why their profit margins were disappearing faster than free donuts in a police station. I spent 3 weeks diving into their books like I was hunting for buried treasure, cross-referencing invoices and purchase orders and vendor contracts until I found the problem. Their main supplier had been gradually increasing prices while simultaneously decreasing quality, but they'd been doing it so slowly that nobody noticed until the cumulative effects started showing up in quarterly reports. It was like financial death by 1,000 paper cuts, and once I pointed it out, the solution was obvious. Henderson's CEO was so grateful he sent me a bottle of bourbon that probably cost more than my car payment, and Omar started looking at me like I'd just performed some kind of workplace miracle instead of just doing basic math with a functioning brain. "You should take on the Meridian account too," he said, sliding another file folder across my desk like he was dealing cards in the world's most boring poker game. "They're having some supply chain issues that sound right up your alley." The weird thing was, I actually wanted to take it on. Not because I needed to prove anything or impress anyone, but because solving puzzles turned out to be satisfying when you weren't spending half your time wondering if your spouse was lying to your face about where she'd been and who she'd been with. Work became this clean, logical space where problems had actual solutions and success was measured in numbers that didn't lie or cheat or suddenly decide they needed space to find themselves. But here's the thing about having extra mental bandwidth. You start noticing that there's a whole world out there beyond your office cubicle and your imploding marriage. I'd been so focused on trying to hold my personal life together that I'd completely forgotten about the community center volunteer orientation I'd signed up for about 8 months ago, back when Sienna was going through her "we should give back more" phase. She'd lost interest after about 2 weeks, which should have been another red flag, but I kept meaning to follow up and just never got around to it. Ms. Chika Okoye ran the tutoring program like she was coordinating a military operation, but with more hugs and a lot more patience for kids who thought math was invented by Satan specifically to ruin their lives. She was one of those people who could look at a room full of fidgety 8-year-olds and somehow transform them into focused little scholars just by believing they were capable of more than they thought they were. "You're here for the homework help program?" she asked when I finally showed up on a Tuesday evening, probably looking like I'd gotten lost on my way to a midlife crisis convention. When I nodded and explained about the delayed follow-up, she just smiled and handed me a name tag like tardiness was just another problem with an obvious solution. Perfect timing. I've got 2 kids who could use someone with your background. That's how I met Zoe, who was 9 years old and had apparently decided that fractions were her personal enemy in a war she was determined to win through sheer stubbornness and creative applications of erasers. She had curly hair that defied gravity and the kind of direct honesty that only kids can pull off without seeming rude. "Are you married?" she asked during our second tutoring session, while we were working through a worksheet that involved dividing pizza slices in ways that somehow made math relevant to her daily life. I said, trying to figure out how to explain divorce to someone whose biggest relationship drama probably involved who got to sit where at the lunch table. "Did she unmarry you?" Zoe asked, which was probably the most accurate description of divorce I'd ever heard. "Yeah, she did." Zoe considered this information while chewing on her pencil eraser, which seemed to be her preferred method of processing complex emotional data. "That sucks," she finally concluded. "Are you sad?" "Sometimes," I said, which was the truth. "But I'm getting better." "Good," she said, turning back to her worksheet like that settled everything. "Will you still come on Tuesdays?" "I'll still come on Tuesdays," I promised, and I meant it. There was something refreshing about Zoe's approach to problem solving. Identify the issue, ask direct questions, figure out what needed to happen next, move forward. No drama, no hidden agendas, just practical solutions and enough flexibility to adapt when circumstances changed. The other kid I worked with was Marcus, who was 11 and had somehow gotten the idea that story problems were designed to trick him rather than teach him. He approached every math question like it was a riddle from a particularly devious sphinx, looking for the hidden catch that would make his answer wrong no matter what he did. Why can't they just ask, "What's 8 times 7, instead of making up some story about train schedules?" He complained during one particularly frustrating session involving word problems that somehow made multiplication more complicated by adding unnecessary narrative elements. Because real life doesn't usually give you problems in nice, clean packages, I told him. Most of the time, you have to figure out what question you're actually trying to answer before you can solve it. Which, now that I thought about it, was probably a lesson I could have used in my marriage. Maybe if I'd spent more time asking the right questions instead of just accepting the answers I was given, I would have figured out what was really going on a lot sooner. But that was the old Jude, the one who'd been operating in crisis management mode for so long that he'd forgotten what normal problem-solving felt like. The new Jude, the one who had time and mental energy for volunteer work and actually enjoyed helping kids figure out fractions, was discovering that life outside the disaster zone was pretty satisfying. Saturdays became about something completely different: hiking. I joined this trail group that met at Zilker Park every weekend, partly because I needed exercise that didn't involve running away from my problems, and partly because I was curious about whether I could handle being around people who didn't know anything about my recent personal catastrophe. Priya was a software engineer who talked about coding like other people talked about poetry, finding beauty in elegant algorithms and well-structured databases. Matteo worked for the city planning department and knew the history behind every bridge and building we passed on our hikes. Breyer was a freelance graphic designer who had strong opinions about font choices and could spot bad kerning from 50 yards away. They knew I was recently divorced because it came up naturally in conversation, but they didn't know about Adrian or Sienna or the whole sordid mess of betrayal and lawyers and corporate investigations. To them, I was just Jude, the guy who liked good coffee and quiet trails and could keep up a steady pace for 10 miles without complaining about the heat. After our hikes, we'd usually hit up this breakfast taco place that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and breakfast tacos that could probably solve most of the world's problems if we could just figure out how to distribute them properly. We'd sit at picnic tables under oak trees, talking about nothing important and everything meaningful: work frustrations, weekend plans, random observations about Austin traffic, and whether the food truck scene was getting too commercialized. It was normal in a way I'd forgotten existed. No hidden agendas, no careful navigation around sensitive topics, no wondering if someone was telling me the truth or just telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Just people being people, sharing breakfast tacos and trail mix, and the kind of easy conversation that happens when nobody's trying to impress anyone else or cover up anything they're ashamed of. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was learning what it felt like to be around people who actually seemed to enjoy my company, not because they needed something from me or felt obligated to include me, but just because they genuinely liked having me around. It was a revelation wrapped in hiking boots and served with a side of salsa verde. My parents, Ruthie and Cal Carter, had this amazing superpower that I didn't fully appreciate until I was sitting in their kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, eating my mom's pozole and realizing they weren't asking me a single goddamn question about my spectacular marital implosion. Not one. No probing about how I was holding up. No gentle suggestions about counseling or giving Sienna another chance. No well-meaning, but ultimately useless advice about forgiveness being more for me than for her. Just regular Sunday lunch conversation about Dad's ongoing war with the neighbor's tree that kept dropping branches in their yard, Mom's book club's heated debate about whether the latest bestseller was genius or pretentious garbage, and whether the Longhorns had any shot at a decent season this year. It was like they'd collectively decided that what I needed wasn't analysis or intervention, but just the simple comfort of being treated like a normal human being instead of a victim of tragic circumstances. They asked about work, about whether I was eating enough vegetables, about whether I'd gotten that weird noise in my car checked out yet. Normal parent stuff that had absolutely nothing to do with my personal life being a smoking crater, and everything to do with the fact that I was still their kid, and they still cared about the mundane details that make up a life. When I finally got up to leave, Mom sent me home with enough pozole to feed a small army and a plant she'd been growing from a cutting that she was convinced I could keep alive despite my historically dismal track record with anything that required regular watering. It's a snake plant, she explained, like this was crucial information. Practically impossible to kill. Even you should be able to manage it. The confidence in that, even you, was both insulting and oddly reassuring. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source, Marina Voss, who had apparently become my unofficial divorce war correspondent. Her text updates were sparse and to the point, like battlefield reports from a commander who didn't have time for unnecessary details. Board escalated. Policy enforced. Settlement posture strong. Each message was like getting intelligence from the front lines of a conflict I was involved in, but didn't have to actively fight, which was exactly how I preferred it. The latest update had been particularly satisfying. Adrian's strategic sabbatical confirmed. Effective immediately, which was corporate speak for, your wife's boyfriend just got fired for being a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. Marina's legal team had apparently built such a comprehensive case that the board didn't just censure Adrian. They launched him into orbit like he was contaminated space debris. But even more satisfying than watching Adrian's professional life implode was discovering Dr. Rowan, a therapist who talked about boundaries like they were architectural features instead of psychological concepts. I'd expected therapy to be all about exploring my feelings and unpacking childhood trauma and other Oprah-approved methods of navel-gazing. Instead, Dr. Rowan treated boundaries like practical tools, the way a contractor might talk about load-bearing walls or proper electrical wiring. Think of boundaries as doors with locks that you control, she said during our third session, sitting in her office that looked more like a comfortable living room than a medical facility. You decide who gets keys, who gets invited in, and who doesn't even get to knock. She had me practice saying simple sentences that felt revolutionary in their directness. No, that doesn't work for me. I'm leaving now. Basic phrases that somehow I'd never learned to use without following them with extensive justification and apology. The homework she gave me was deceptively simple. Make a list of personal rules and stick to them for 1 week. Not goals or aspirations or things I hope to accomplish eventually, but actual rules with real consequences. The list I came up with felt both obvious and radical. Rule number 1. I do not explain my no. If someone asks me to do something and I don't want to do it, no is a complete sentence. I don't owe anyone a detailed breakdown of my reasoning, a cost-benefit analysis of my time, or a dissertation on why their request doesn't align with my priorities. No means no, period, end of discussion. Rule number 2. I do not chase people who hurt me. If someone decides they want to be out of my life, either through their actions or their choices, I'm not going to spend my energy trying to convince them otherwise. People show you who they are through their behavior, and when they show you they're willing to hurt you, believe them the first time. Rule number 3. I do not rescue what chooses to drown. This one was specifically about Sienna, but really applied to anyone who creates their own problems and then expects other people to fix them. If someone wants to make destructive choices, that's their right, but they don't get to make those choices my responsibility. The first time I had to use these rules was when Sienna called me about 2 weeks later, crying about how her landlord was being unreasonable about some damaged deposit issue, and could I please just talk to him, because I was so much better at handling these kinds of confrontations. The old Jude would have probably driven over there with a toolbox and a checkbook, ready to solve whatever problem she'd created through some combination of poor planning and magical thinking. The new Jude said, "That doesn't work for me," and hung up. She called back 3 times. I didn't answer. She left increasingly desperate voicemails explaining how this wasn't about us. This was just about being a decent human being to someone who was struggling. The 4th voicemail included some creative language about how I'd become cold and selfish since the divorce, as if basic self-preservation was somehow a character flaw. I deleted all the messages without listening to them completely and went about my day. It felt weird, like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but it also felt powerful in a way that was completely unfamiliar. For the first time in years, I was choosing what problems deserved my attention, and surprise, surprise, other people's self-created emergencies didn't make the cut. The same rules applied to work, where I discovered that saying, "I'm not available for evening calls unless it's a genuine emergency," didn't result in my immediate termination or professional exile. Instead, people just adjusted their expectations and started planning their crises during business hours like functional adults. Amazing how that worked. Dr. Rowan explained that boundaries aren't walls meant to keep everyone out. They're more like property lines that let people know where they stand and what the rules are for being in your space. Good boundaries actually make relationships better, she said, because everyone knows what to expect. People can't violate rules they don't know exist, and you can't get angry at them for crossing lines you never drew. The snake plant my mother had given me became a weird symbol of this whole boundary thing. I put it in my home office, right next to my diplomas and my childhood baseball card collection. Things that were mine, that represented my interests and achievements and the parts of my life that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or participation. Every morning when I saw that plant still being alive, it felt like a small victory over my historical inability to take care of things that depended on me. But the biggest test came when my cousin Derek invited me to his wedding, which was happening in 2 months and would inevitably involve questions about Sienna, sympathetic looks from relatives who'd heard about the divorce through the family gossip network, and probably some well-meaning aunt asking when I was going to get back out there, like dating was some kind of recreational sport I'd temporarily quit. The old Jude would have spent weeks dreading it, maybe even skipped it entirely to avoid the awkwardness. The new Jude RSVP'd yes, bought Derek a nice gift from his registry, and started mentally preparing responses to the inevitable questions that would be both truthful and brief. The marriage didn't work out. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Complete sentences that didn't invite further discussion or require detailed explanation. Because here's what I was learning. Most people who ask personal questions aren't actually looking for honest answers. They're just making conversation or satisfying their own curiosity. They don't need to know about Adrian Voss or the video or the credit card receipts or any of the gory details that had consumed my life for the past several months. They just need to know that I'm okay, that I'm handling my business, and that I'm not going to make things weird by oversharing about my personal disasters. The wedding would be a test run for the new version of myself. The guy who could attend social functions without feeling like he had to explain or justify his life choices to people who weren't actually invested in the answers anyway. The first holiday season after your marriage explodes is weird in the same way that losing a limb is probably weird. You keep reaching for something that isn't there anymore, expecting traditions that no longer exist, and realizing how many of your automatic responses were built around someone else's presence. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Once you get past the initial weirdness, holidays without drama are actually kind of amazing. No negotiations about whose family to visit first. No passive-aggressive comments about gift budgets. No theatrical sighs about how commercial everything has become, while simultaneously demanding the perfect Instagram-worthy Christmas morning. I discovered this revelation sometime around Thanksgiving, when I realized I could spend the entire day in my pajamas watching football, without someone making pointed comments about how we should probably do something special, or maybe we could invite people over this year. Instead, I made a turkey sandwich, opened a beer at noon because I'm a grown-ass adult and it was a holiday, and watched the Cowboys lose in spectacular fashion without having to pretend I cared about the halftime show or explain why third and long was significant to someone who was only paying attention when the commercials came on. But the real game changer was Christmas shopping, which had always been this elaborate psychological warfare where every purchase was somehow both too expensive and not thoughtful enough, too practical and not romantic enough, too much effort and not enough effort, depending on Sienna's mood and whatever magazine article she'd read about love languages that week. This year, I bought exactly what I wanted to buy for the people I actually cared about: a decent bottle of bourbon for my dad, a cookbook about Mexican street food for my mom, gift cards for my hiking buddies, and toys for the kids at the community center. No spreadsheets, no stress, no wondering whether the person receiving the gift would interpret it as some kind of coded message about the state of our relationship. Just simple transactions based on knowing what people actually liked and having enough money to buy it without feeling guilty about the expense or resentful about the obligation. The house itself became a completely different kind of space during the holidays. Instead of turning it into some kind of magazine-worthy winter wonderland that required 3 weeks of planning and a detailed lighting scheme, I bought a small tree that fit perfectly in the corner of the living room, hung some lights that didn't require an engineering degree to install, and called it done. No themed ornament collections, no matching color schemes, no elaborate centerpieces that cost more than most people's car payments. And you know what? It was perfect. The tree smelled like Christmas, the lights were warm and cheerful, and I could enjoy the whole thing without worrying about whether it met someone else's standards for holiday excellence. I even bought myself a ridiculously expensive espresso machine, the kind of purchase that would have required a family meeting and extensive justification back when I was married, but now just required swiping my credit card and finding a place for it on the kitchen counter. That espresso machine became symbolic of something larger. The permission to enjoy things simply because they brought me joy, not because they served some greater purpose or fit into someone else's vision of what my life should look like. Every morning when I made my coffee with beans I'd ground myself, in a machine that made sounds like a small aircraft taking off, I felt like I was giving myself a gift that no one could take away or complain about or use as evidence that I was being selfish with money. The living room got a similar treatment when I replaced our old, uncomfortable couch, chosen because it photographed well and went with everything. With a massive sectional that was so soft you could disappear into it for hours. It was the kind of furniture that prioritized comfort over aesthetics, function over form, and personal preference over what looked good to other people. I could sprawl across the entire thing watching Netflix, take naps that lasted 3 hours, and not worry about whether the cushions looked presentable if someone stopped by unexpectedly. My home office became a shrine to things that actually mattered to me, instead of being carefully curated to present the right image to visitors who never came anyway. I hung my college diplomas on the wall, not because they impressed anyone, but because I'd worked hard for them and they represented something I was proud of. My childhood baseball card collection, which had been banished to a closet because it was too juvenile for a grown man's office, got a place of honor on the bookshelf next to leadership manuals and industry publications. Work started reflecting these changes too, in ways that surprised everyone, including me. Omar Shah pulled me into his office right before Christmas with news that felt surreal: a promotion, a significant raise, and responsibility for the firm's biggest client portfolio. "You've been different this year," he said, leaning back in his chair like he was trying to figure out what had changed. "More decisive, more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What I was doing was showing up as myself instead of as some carefully constructed version of myself designed to avoid conflict and manage other people's emotions. When clients asked for my opinion, I gave it directly instead of hedging everything with qualifiers and escape clauses. When team meetings got bogged down in endless discussion, I moved things forward with actual decisions instead of waiting for consensus that would never come. When problems needed solving, I solved them instead of forming committees to study the feasibility of maybe addressing them eventually. The team I inherited responded to this approach like they'd been waiting their whole careers for someone to just tell them what needed to happen and trust them to figure out how to make it happen. I took them to El Molino, Austin's most no-nonsense Tex-Mex place, and laid out 3 simple rules. Clear timelines, no heroics, and tell the truth early. No elaborate mission statements, no team-building exercises, no motivational speeches about synergy and paradigm shifts. Just basic expectations that treated them like competent adults instead of children who needed constant supervision and encouragement. The result was a team that got calmer and faster, more efficient and less stressed, because they knew exactly what was expected of them and didn't have to spend time guessing what I really meant or trying to read between the lines of carefully diplomatic language. When Priya asked if I was dating during one of our post-hike breakfast taco sessions, I told her lightly, which was both completely true and completely sufficient as an answer. I wasn't shopping for forever, wasn't looking for someone to complete me or fix the parts of my life that felt empty. I was practicing joy, figuring out what actually made me happy instead of what I thought should make me happy, learning to enjoy my own company instead of constantly seeking external validation, discovering that contentment could come from simple things like perfectly brewed coffee and Sunday afternoon naps on a couch that felt like being hugged by a cloud. The holidays passed quietly and peacefully, without drama or disappointment or the exhausting emotional labor of managing someone else's expectations while pretending my own didn't matter. For the first time in years, January felt like a beginning instead of just another month of the same old compromises and accommodations that had been slowly strangling the life out of me. 3 years is exactly long enough for the sharp edges of catastrophe to wear smooth, for the daily reminders of what you lost to fade into the background noise of a life that's learned to function without them. 3 years is how long it takes for running into your ex-wife's friend in the cereal aisle at H-E-B to feel like a minor inconvenience instead of a major emotional event, which is exactly what happened on a Tuesday evening when I was trying to decide between Honey Nut Cheerios and some organic cardboard that claimed to be good for my digestive health. Katrina had been one of Sienna's closest friends back when I still thought I knew who Sienna was. Back when we'd have them over for dinner parties where everyone pretended to care about wine pairings and made small talk about home renovation projects and vacation plans. She looked exactly the same. Carefully maintained hair, designer workout clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and that particular Austin blend of wellness culture and subtle competitiveness that made every conversation feel like a performance. "Jude," she said, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners or people who'd just discovered they weren't dying after all. "Oh my God, you look amazing. Like, really amazing. Have you been working out? You seem so, I don't know, centered." The truth was, I did feel good. Not in the desperate, overcompensating way that divorced guys sometimes throw themselves into CrossFit or motorcycle ownership, but in the quiet, sustainable way that comes from actually liking the life you've built instead of just enduring it. I'd been hiking regularly for 3 years now, eating food that tasted good instead of food that photographed well, sleeping 8 hours a night on sheets I'd picked out myself, and generally treating my body like it belonged to someone I cared about instead of someone I was constantly disappointed in. "I'm doing well," I said, which was both completely true and completely sufficient. No need to elaborate on the journey, the therapy, the boundaries, or the slow process of learning to be happy without needing someone else's permission first. But Katrina wasn't done mining for information, because apparently seeing your friend's ex-husband thriving in the wild was some kind of social curiosity that needed to be satisfied. "Do you ever hear from Sienna?" she asked, lowering her voice like we were discussing state secrets instead of basic post-divorce logistics. "No," I said, and realized as the word came out of my mouth that it was both completely accurate and completely peaceful. I didn't hear from Sienna, didn't think about Sienna, didn't wonder what Sienna was doing or whether she was happy or sorry or successful in whatever life she'd built after blowing up ours. It wasn't that I wished her ill, it was more that she'd become irrelevant to my daily existence. The way high school classmates become irrelevant once you realize you're never going to see them again and don't particularly want to. The lack of curiosity surprised even me. For the first year after the divorce, I'd been obsessed with intelligence gathering, checking social media like a stalker, asking mutual friends casual questions that weren't actually casual at all. But somewhere along the way, that obsession had just evaporated. Like waking up one day and realizing you no longer cared whether your favorite TV show got renewed, because you'd found better things to watch. Katrina seemed to take my indifference as an invitation to provide updates anyway, the way people always do when they think they're giving you information you want, but are too proud to ask for directly. She's doing okay, I think. She moved to Dallas for a while, then came back, then took this marketing job at some startup downtown. You know how it is with startups. Lots of equity promises, not so much actual money. She paused, probably waiting for me to show some sign of interest or concern or vindication, but I was mostly just wondering whether the organic cereal was worth an extra $3 for the privilege of eating cardboard that claimed to support sustainable farming practices. As for Adrian, she continued, apparently determined to provide a complete status report on everyone who'd participated in the destruction of my first marriage. I heard he took some kind of strategic sabbatical after that whole thing with the board review. Marina's foundation doubled their STEM scholarships, though, so I guess something good came out of all that mess. This was the first I'd heard about Marina's foundation expansion, and it made me smile in a way that probably looked mysterious to Katrina, but was actually just genuine appreciation for a woman who'd turned personal betrayal into public good. Marina Voss had taken the energy she could have spent on revenge and channeled it into something that would help kids get better educations. It was exactly the kind of move I'd expect from someone who treated life like a chess game and was always thinking 3 moves ahead. The conversation wrapped up with the usual pleasantries and promises to stay in touch that we both knew were polite fiction, and I finished my grocery shopping with the strange realization that running into Sienna's friend had felt about as emotionally significant as running into my mailman. Pleasant enough, briefly informative, but ultimately just another minor interaction in a day full of minor interactions. Driving home, I thought about how weird it was that 3 years ago, that conversation would have ruined my entire week. I would have spent hours analyzing every word, wondering what Sienna had said about me, whether she was happy or struggling, whether she ever thought about what we'd had and lost. Now it was just information that didn't particularly affect me one way or another, like hearing about the weather in a city I'd never visit. My house looked exactly like what it was, a place where someone lived who knew what he liked and wasn't ashamed of it. The slate blue bedroom that had felt revolutionary 3 years ago now just felt like home. The expensive espresso machine had earned its place on the counter by making thousands of perfect cups of coffee. The massive sectional had supported countless naps, movie marathons, and Sunday afternoons spent reading books that nobody else had to approve of or pretend to find interesting. But the real transformation was in the smaller details, the ones that only I would notice. The way I could leave dishes in the sink overnight without feeling guilty about it. The way I could spend an entire Saturday doing absolutely nothing productive without someone making comments about wasted time or missed opportunities. The way I could buy groceries based on what I actually wanted to eat instead of what would photograph well for social media or impress dinner guests who were probably too polite to admit they didn't like quinoa any more than I did. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a perfect cup of espresso, watching the sky turn that particular shade of pink that only happens in Texas during the 20 minutes between day and night. The air was warm enough that I didn't need a jacket, cool enough that sitting outside felt like a choice instead of an endurance test. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear kids playing in someone's backyard, the sound of laughter and splash fights that meant summer was officially here and school was officially out. I'd set out my trail shoes for the next morning's hike, because Wednesday mornings had become my favorite time to hit the greenbelt before the heat got too oppressive and the trails got too crowded with people who treated hiking like a competitive sport instead of a moving meditation. Priya, Mateo, and Briar would be there, probably arguing about whether breakfast tacos from the gas station counted as authentic Austin cuisine, definitely planning whatever weekend adventure they'd talk me into this time. My phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Chica Okie asking if I could cover Thursday tutoring because one of the other volunteers had a family emergency, and I texted back, of course, without even checking my calendar first. Thursday tutoring meant helping Marcus with his summer reading and listening to Zoe explain whatever scientific phenomenon she'd discovered on YouTube that week. It meant being the kind of adult who showed up consistently, who kept promises, who treated other people's problems like they mattered. The house was quiet but full, empty of other people, but completely occupied by a life that fit me like clothes I'd had tailored instead of bought off the rack. Every room reflected choices I'd made for reasons that made sense to me, from the diplomas on the office wall to the baseball cards that had finally found their way out of storage to the snake plant that had not only survived but actually thrived under my care, growing new shoots like a green middle finger to everyone who'd ever suggested I couldn't take care of anything that depended on me. 3 years had taught me that the best revenge isn't their suffering. It's this life that fits like a perfectly broken-in pair of boots, comfortable and sturdy and ready for whatever terrain comes next. It's the discovery that happiness doesn't require anyone else's participation or approval. That contentment can come from simple things like good coffee and quiet evenings, and the satisfaction of showing up for people who need you to show up. Sienna and Adrian had blown up for lives because they thought they deserved something more exciting than what they had, something that felt more like the movies and less like real life with its mundane pleasures and ordinary commitments. They'd chased drama and passion and the thrill of secrets and stolen moments. And from what I could tell, they'd ended up with exactly what that kind of thinking usually gets you: chaos, complications, and the kind of happiness that requires constant maintenance and validation from other people. Meanwhile, I'd learned to find joy in things that didn't require anyone else's cooperation. The perfect espresso, the satisfaction of a problem solved at work, the feeling of strong legs carrying me up a difficult trail, the simple pleasure of being exactly where I wanted to be instead of pretending to be somewhere else. I'd built a life that belonged entirely to me, that couldn't be taken away by someone else's bad decisions or midlife crisis or sudden discovery that they'd rather be with someone else. The kids I tutored would grow up and probably forget my name, but maybe they'd remember that adults sometimes kept their promises. The hiking group might drift apart as people moved and changed and found new interests, but we'd have had these perfect Saturday mornings together, sharing breakfast tacos and bad jokes, and the simple pleasure of walking through beautiful places with people whose company we enjoyed. My parents would continue to send me home with too much food and plants I might or might not kill, treating me like their son instead of a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Work would continue to reward me for showing up as myself instead of as some carefully constructed version of myself designed to avoid conflict and manage other people's emotions. And I would continue to wake up each morning in a house that felt like home, in a life that felt like mine, surrounded by choices that made sense and relationships that didn't require constant negotiation or management or apology. The best part wasn't that I'd won or that they'd lost. It was that I'd stopped keeping score entirely, stopped measuring my happiness against anyone else's success or failure, stopped caring whether the people who'd hurt me were thriving or struggling somewhere else in a life that had nothing to do with me anymore. 3 years in light. That's what recovery looked like. Not the absence of darkness, but the presence of illumination that came from finally understanding what you actually needed instead of what you thought you were supposed to want. I came home from a classified mission and was met with handcuffs. My cheating wife stood there, fake tears, claiming I killed her father. My son took the stand and said, "I saw him do it." The judge asked if I had a final word. I slid a sealed envelope across the table. He opened it and froze. "Lock the doors. No one leaves." You know what they say about homecomings? Yeah, well, they lied. Mine came with a welcoming committee I definitely didn't put on my wish list. 2 cops and a pair of handcuffs that felt colder than a penguin's ass in Antarctica. The metal bit into my wrist before I'd even processed what the hell was happening, which is saying something because my reflexes are usually sharper than a pissed-off porcupine. I'd just stepped through my own front door, for crying out loud. My duffel bag was still hanging off my shoulder like some pathetic olive branch, stuffed with dirty laundry and memories from a mission that officially never happened. You know the kind, the ones where Uncle Sam sends you somewhere that doesn't exist to do things that never occurred. Standard Tuesday for guys like me, except this Tuesday decided to take a hard left turn into Crazy Town. The first thing that hit me wasn't the cuffs, though. It was the smell. My house smelled wrong. Not like the usual blend of old coffee and whatever cheap air freshener Marissa bought in bulk from Costco. This was different, heavier, more deliberate. like someone had been staging a goddamn Broadway production in my living room while I was gone. Then I saw her, Marissa, my loving wife of 15 years, standing by our staircase like some tragic heroine from a soap opera that got canceled for being too dramatic. And let me tell you, the woman knew how to put on a show. Her mascara was doing that perfect streaky thing. Not too much, not too little, just enough to scream, grieving widow, without looking like a raccoon that got hit by a garbage truck. Her blonde hair was slightly mussed, like she'd been running her fingers through it in distress, but I could tell she'd practiced the look in our bathroom mirror. I'd lived with this woman long enough to know the difference between genuine tears and the kind you order from the catalog of convenient emotions. The cops flanking me were your typical small-town variety. One looked like he spent more time at Dunkin' Donuts than the gym. The other had that eager rookie energy that screamed, "I watched too much CSI." Neither of them seemed particularly comfortable with whatever script they'd been handed. But hey, a paycheck's a paycheck, right? "Ma'am," the chunky one said, his voice carrying that forced gentleness cops use when they're trying not to spook the witnesses. "Are you ready to make your statement?" Marissa nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that looked suspiciously fresh. No crumpled edges, no makeup stains. Props department really went all out on this production. She took a shaky breath, and damn, even I had to admit the woman had missed her calling as an actress before delivering her lines with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing. "He killed my father." For words. That's all it took to flip my world upside down like a pancake in the hands of a short-order cook having a nervous breakdown. Not, "I think he killed my father," or "I'm worried he might have hurt my father." Nope. Straight to the point, delivered with the kind of certainty usually reserved for discussing the weather or the fact that politicians are lying sacks of shit. The rookie cop shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively moving to his notebook like he was about to take down a confession from public enemy number one. Meanwhile, my brain was doing that thing it does in crisis situations, cataloging details, filing away information, trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were apparently made of pure, concentrated bullshit. Her father, Harold Brennan, a man who'd never liked me from day one, which was fair enough because the feeling was pretty mutual. He thought I wasn't good enough for his princess daughter, and I thought he was a pretentious windbag who collected antique coins and complained about kids these days like he hadn't been young once himself. But kill the guy? Please. I had bigger fish to fry and better ways to spend my limited free time. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice level because losing your shit never helps anything. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." The chunky cop, his name tag read Patterson, shook his head with the kind of authority that comes from watching too many police procedurals. "No mistake, sir. We have a witness statement and evidence placing you at the scene." Evidence. Now that was interesting. Because the last time I'd seen Harold Brennan alive, he'd been bitching about the neighbor's dog crapping on his precious lawn while I nodded politely and counted the minutes until I could escape back to my own house. That was 3 weeks ago, right before I got called away on my little vacation to nowhere. Marissa was watching me now, and for just a split second, I caught something in her eyes that didn't match the grieving daughter act. It was there and gone so fast I almost missed it, but 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in your spouse's expressions. What I saw wasn't grief or shock, or even anger. It was calculation. Cold, careful calculation, like she was watching a chess game and waiting to see if I'd make the move she was expecting. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some tragic misunderstanding or a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was orchestrated, planned, executed with the kind of precision I usually reserve for my day job. Someone had painted a target on my back, and they'd done it with enough skill to make it stick. The rookie was reading me my rights now, his voice cracking slightly on the part about remaining silent. Ironic, considering silence had been my specialty for years. Marissa was still dabbing at those perfectly placed tears, playing the role of the devastated daughter who discovered her husband was a monster. The whole scene was so perfectly staged it could have won a fucking Emmy. But here's the thing about guys like me. We're trained to see patterns, to spot the flaws in even the most carefully constructed lies. And this lie, beautiful as it was, had cracks. Small ones, but cracks nonetheless. The way her breathing was too controlled. The way she kept glancing at the door like she was expecting someone else to show up. The way her grip on that tissue never loosened enough to actually use it. As they led me toward the door, my own front door that I'd walked through less than 5 minutes ago as a free man, I made myself a promise. Whatever game Marissa was playing, whatever elaborate setup she'd constructed while I was gone, I was going to figure it out. And when I did, she was going to learn that framing a man who kills people for a living isn't just stupid, it's suicidal. The last thing I saw before they shoved me into the back of their patrol car was Marissa, still standing by that staircase, still clutching her prop tissue, still playing her role to perfection. But her eyes followed me through the window, and in them, I saw something that confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. If you think getting handcuffed in your own living room is a kick in the teeth, try having your 12-year-old son throw you under the bus in front of God, country, and 2 cops who probably peaked in high school. That's the kind of pain that makes waterboarding feel like a spa day. They dragged me down to the station faster than you could say Miranda rights, and now here I was, sitting in an interrogation room that looked like it was decorated by someone who thought beige was too exciting. The walls were that special shade of institutional gray that screamed, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And the fluorescent lights buzzed with the enthusiasm of a dying wasp. Real homey atmosphere they had going. Patterson, the chunky cop from my living room, was doing his best impression of a hard-ass detective, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't spilled coffee on his shirt during the drive over. His partner, whose name I'd learned was Officer Martinez, looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Can't say I blame the kid. So, Mr. Kane, Patterson said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned in protest. Want to tell us where you were 3 nights ago between 9 and 11 p.m.? 3 nights ago, right around the time I was busy not killing Harold Brennan because I was approximately 2,000 miles away, doing things that would remain classified until the heat death of the universe. But since I couldn't exactly hand them my real itinerary without causing an international incident, I went with the standard response. I'd like to call my lawyer. Patterson's face scrunched up like he'd bitten into a lemon that had gone bad sometime during the Clinton administration. Come on now, Kane. If you're innocent, what do you need a lawyer for? Just tell us what happened. The old innocent people don't need lawyers routine. Right up there with if you've got nothing to hide. And trust me, I'm from the government, in the Hall of Fame of bullshit statements. I'd heard this song and dance before, usually right before someone tried to pin a war crime on some poor bastard who'd been following orders. That's when they brought him in. Jordan, my son, my 12-year-old boy who used to think I hung the moon and personally installed all the stars just for his entertainment. The kid who would run to the door every time I came home, even if I'd only been gone to grab milk from the corner store. The same kid who was now walking into this gray hellhole, looking like he'd rather be getting his teeth pulled without anesthesia. He wouldn't look at me, not even a glance. His eyes were fixed on some fascinating spot on the floor, like he'd discovered the secrets of the universe hidden in the scuff marks left by 1,000 other suspects. His usually messy brown hair was combed neat, too neat, like someone had spent time making sure he looked presentable for the cameras. Because of course there were cameras. Can't have a good family destruction without proper documentation. Jordan, Martinez said, his voice gentle in that way cops use when they're talking to kids or crazy people. This is your dad, right? My son, my own flesh and blood, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, nodded without lifting his eyes. Just a quick bob of his head, like he was confirming the weather forecast instead of identifying his old man in a murder investigation. And you understand that you don't have to talk to us if you don't want to, Martinez continued. Your mom explained that you wanted to tell us something important. Oh, did she now? How thoughtful of Marissa to help our son decide what he wanted to do. I could practically see her fingerprints all over this whole setup, like she'd been coaching him for weeks. Hell, knowing her, she probably had flashcards made up. Jordan finally spoke, and his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. I saw him do it. For more words. Apparently, the Kane family was going for some kind of record in life-destroying brevity. But these 4 words hit different. When Marissa had said I killed her father, it felt like getting sucker-punched by a stranger. When Jordan said he saw me do it, it felt like my own heart had decided to file for divorce and take half my soul in the settlement. Can you tell us what you saw, son? Patterson asked, leaning forward with the kind of fake concern that wouldn't fool a golden retriever. And that's when my boy, the kid who used to tell me everything, From what happened at school to his elaborate theories about why dogs couldn't talk, started reciting a story that sounded like it had been written by someone else and memorized word for word. I was supposed to be sleeping, he said, still staring at that damn floor like it held all the answers to life's mysteries. But I heard voices outside. Loud voices. So I looked out my window, and I saw Dad and Grandpa Harold arguing in Grandpa's driveway. Bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. 3 nights ago, I was sitting in a safe house in Eastern Europe, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard seasoned with disappointment and wondering why the hell I'd chosen a career that involved so much hurry up and wait. But Jordan kept going, his voice getting steadier as he warmed up to his performance. Dad was really angry. He was yelling about money, I think. And then, Jordan paused, swallowing hard like the words were stuck in his throat. And then he pushed Grandpa Harold, and Grandpa fell down and hit his head on the concrete step. The room went dead quiet except for the buzz of those fluorescent lights and the sound of my world crashing down around my ears like a controlled demolition gone wrong. Martinez was scribbling notes like his life depended on it. Patterson was nodding along like Jordan had just solved world hunger, and I was sitting there wondering how the hell my own son had become such a convincing liar. Because that's what this was, a lie. A carefully constructed, perfectly delivered lie that someone had fed to my 12-year-old boy and convinced him was the truth. The details were too clean, too specific, too perfectly aligned with whatever story they needed to tell. Real memories are messy, full of gaps and uncertainty. This sounded like a movie script. And what did your dad do after Grandpa Harold fell? Martinez asked gently. Jordan's voice got even quieter. He just stood there for a minute. Then he checked to see if anyone was watching, and when he saw me in the window, he put his finger to his lips, like he was telling me to keep it secret. The shush gesture. Classic intimidation move, according to every crime show that had ever been made. Except I'd never made that gesture to Jordan in my life, unless you counted the time I told him to be quiet during a movie because his mom was trying to sleep on the couch. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my son by the shoulders and shake him until the real memories came loose from whatever bullshit someone had packed into his head. I wanted to tell him that his dad might be a lot of things, absent, secretive, probably not winning any Father of the Year awards, but he wasn't a murderer. At least, not the kind who killed family members in suburban driveways. But I couldn't do any of that, because the moment I opened my mouth to defend myself, I'd be the angry, violent man trying to intimidate a child witness. The optics were already bad enough without me adding to the performance. So I sat there, watching my son destroy me with words that weren't his own, delivered in a voice that barely sounded like him anymore. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my ribs, not my resolve, but something deeper. Something that had to do with bedtime stories and piggyback rides, and the way he used to look at me like I was Superman and Batman rolled into one incredibly awesome package. That was gone now. Maybe forever. And the worst part? Jordan probably didn't even understand what he was doing. In his mind, he was just telling the nice policeman what Mommy had helped him remember. He had no idea he was putting the final nail in his father's coffin with every carefully rehearsed word. When he finally finished his story, Jordan looked up for just a second. Our eyes met across that shitty gray table, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't guilt or sadness or even fear. It was nothing, just empty, like he was looking at a stranger. Welcome to the Hilton. If the Hilton was designed by someone who thought concrete and despair made excellent interior design choices. My new accommodations came complete with bars for windows, a toilet that had seen better decades, and the kind of ambience that screamed, "Abandon all hope. Ye who enter here," in 12 different languages. The booking process had been a real treat too. Fingerprints, photos, the whole 9 yards of humiliation served up with a side of bureaucratic indifference. They'd processed me like I was some 2-bit gangster instead of a guy who'd spent the better part of his adult life keeping this country's enemies from doing very bad things to very good people. But hey, apparently none of that mattered when your own family decided to throw you under the bus and back over you a few times for good measure. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect from a place that prioritized function over comfort, which is to say it had all the charm of a morgue and twice the personality. The walls were that special shade of institutional green that someone, somewhere, had decided was calming. Probably the same genius who thought airplane food was delicious and that waiting at the DMV was efficient. The paint was chipped and scarred from years of hosting guests who weren't exactly thrilled with their accommodations. My cellmate for the evening was a guy who looked like he'd been rode hard and put away wet repeatedly. He was curled up on the bottom bunk, snoring with the enthusiasm of a chainsaw cutting through a redwood. The smell coming off him suggested he'd been marinating in cheap whiskey and poor life choices for the better part of a week. At least he wasn't chatty. I took the top bunk, not because I was being polite, but because sleeping above a drunk stranger was marginally better than sleeping next to one. The mattress felt like it was stuffed with broken dreams and recycled disappointment, but I'd slept on worse. Afghanistan had taught me that comfort was relative, and compared to a foxhole in the middle of a sandstorm, this was practically the Ritz. But sleep? Yeah, that wasn't happening. My brain was doing that thing it does when everything goes sideways, running scenarios, analyzing variables, trying to figure out how the hell I'd ended up in this particular circle of hell. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Marissa, standing in our living room, playing the grieving daughter like she'd been born for the role. Here's the thing about my wife, ex-wife, whatever the hell she was now, she'd never been particularly good at hiding her tells. 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in someone's expressions, and I'd gotten pretty damn good at spotting when Marissa was running a con. The way she'd bite her lower lip when she was lying about where she'd been. The way she'd touch her earring when she was about to say something she didn't mean. The way she'd look just slightly to the left when she was reciting something she'd memorized instead of remembered. And tonight she'd been hitting all those tells like she was playing them on a fucking piano. The carefully placed tears, the perfectly timed pauses, the way she delivered that line about me killing her father, it was all performance. Grade A, Oscar-worthy performance, but performance nonetheless. The question was why? What did she gain from putting me in a cage? Sure, she'd never been thrilled about my job, my long absences, the classified nature of most of my work. She'd made that clear enough over the years with her passive-aggressive comments about normal husbands and real relationships. But framing me for murder? That seemed like overkill, even for someone who thought my idea of a romantic evening involved checking the perimeter and making sure all the locks were secure. Then there was Jordan, my son, my boy who'd looked me in the eye and calmly described watching me commit a crime I'd never committed in a place I'd never been. The kid was 12, not exactly master manipulator material, which meant someone had gotten to him first. Someone had spent time coaching him, feeding him details, making sure his story was airtight. The drunk on the bottom bunk let out a particularly spectacular snore that sounded like a freight train having an argument with a garbage disposal. I stared at the ceiling, counting water stains and trying to piece together the timeline. 3 nights ago, Harold Brennan had died. According to Jordan's testimony, I'd been there, angry about money, pushing the old man around until he took a header into his own front steps. Except 3 nights ago, I'd been approximately 2,000 miles away, sitting in a safe house and watching some very bad people do very bad things to some very important infrastructure. The kind of mission that came with its own paperwork in triplicate and enough classified stamps to wallpaper a small house. But since I couldn't exactly hand over my real alibi without causing an international incident, I was stuck playing defense with nothing but my word and a growing suspicion that someone had orchestrated this whole thing with military precision. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't like. Marissa's sudden interest in having Jordan spend more time with her father over the past few months. The way she'd been pushing for me to take that last mission, practically shoving me out the door when the call came. The convenient timing of Harold's death, right when I was guaranteed to be out of the country with no way to verify my whereabouts. This wasn't just betrayal. This was strategy. Long-term, carefully planned strategy that required patience, resources, and a level of cold calculation that I hadn't given my wife credit for. Apparently, I'd been seriously underestimating the woman who couldn't remember to pick up milk from the store, but had somehow managed to construct an airtight frame job that would make the CIA proud. The fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed and flickered like it was having its own existential crisis, casting weird shadows through the bars. Somewhere down the corridor, another guest was having a heated conversation with someone who wasn't there, his voice echoing off the concrete walls like a one-man Greek chorus of crazy. But in the quiet moments between the snoring and the ranting and the buzzing, I found something I hadn't expected: clarity. See, when you've spent enough time in genuinely dangerous situations, the kind where people are actively trying to kill you with automatic weapons and improvised explosives, sitting in a jail cell starts to feel almost peaceful. No incoming fire, no mission parameters to worry about, no innocent civilians to protect. Just time to think. And what I was thinking was that Marissa had made a critical error. She'd treated this like a domestic dispute instead of what it actually was: a war. And in war, the side that gets cocky usually gets dead. She'd played her opening moves beautifully. I had to give her that. The grieving widow act, the manipulated child witness, the carefully constructed timeline that put me at the scene of the crime with motive and opportunity. But every good soldier knows that the battle isn't won in the opening moves. It's won in the long game, in the patience to wait for your enemy to overextend themselves, in the discipline to gather intelligence before making your move. And Marissa had just given me something precious: time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to figure out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went and who else was dancing to her tune. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear as I lay there listening to my drunk cellmate's symphony of snores. This wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient husband. This was bigger than that. More complicated than that. This was about money, power, and the kind of long-term planning that suggested I wasn't dealing with an amateur. Marissa might be a lot of things, but she wasn't a mastermind. Which meant someone else was pulling the strings, someone with the resources and connections to make this whole elaborate setup work. The question was, who? You know what they say about hindsight? It's 2020 and a real son of a bitch. Sitting in that concrete paradise, staring at water stains that looked like abstract art painted by someone having a particularly bad day, my brain decided it was the perfect time for a highlight reel of all the red flags I'd been too stupid or too busy to notice. Thanks, brain. Real helpful timing. The thing about being married to someone for 15 years is that you develop this weird ability to ignore the obvious. It's like relationship camouflage. You get so used to the way things are that you stop seeing the way things actually are. And boy, had I been wearing some industrial strength blinders when it came to my loving wife. Our marriage hadn't just been rotting. It had been decomposing like roadkill in August heat, and I'd been walking around pretending everything smelled like roses. The signs were all there, flashing like neon lights at a strip club, but apparently I'd been too focused on keeping the world safe for democracy to notice that my own home front was staging a fucking coup. It started with the deployments. Not the fact that I had to go. Hell, she knew what she was signing up for when she married a guy whose job description included "locations may vary" and "bring your own body armor." But somewhere along the way, her attitude shifted from supportive wife to resentful prisoner. Like I was deliberately choosing to leave her behind instead of following orders that came from people who could make my life very complicated if I decided to play hooky. Other husbands come home for dinner, she'd say, usually while I was trying to decompress from 3 weeks of dodging bullets and eating food that tasted like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually met a human being. Other husbands coach Little League and fix leaky faucets and remember anniversaries. Right. Other husbands. The mythical creatures who apparently lived in some parallel universe where the biggest threat to national security was running out of barbecue sauce at the company picnic. I tried explaining that my job was a little more complicated than selling insurance or managing a target, but that conversation always ended the same way, with Marissa sighing dramatically and me feeling like I'd somehow failed at being human. Then there was the silence thing. Occupational hazard of spending your life in classified situations. You get real good at not talking about your day. Can't exactly come home and chat about the weather when you've been somewhere that officially doesn't exist, doing things that never happened to people who were never there. But to Marissa, my inability to share details felt like rejection. You don't trust me, she'd accuse, which was hilarious because trust had nothing to do with it. It's not that I didn't trust her. It's that the guys who signed my paychecks had some very specific opinions about operational security, and those opinions came with prison sentences attached if you decided to get chatty with your spouse. But the real turning point, the moment I should have known we were headed for disaster, came about 8 months ago. I was supposed to be rotating back from a particularly unpleasant assignment involving some very unfriendly people in a very unfriendly part of the world, but the mission got extended. Last-minute intelligence, high-value target, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often. So I called home to let Marissa know I'd be delayed another 2 weeks. She didn't take it well. There was crying, there was yelling, there were accusations about my priorities and my commitment to this family. Standard operating procedure for these kinds of conversations. But then she said something that should have stopped me cold. I can't do this anymore, David. I can't keep pretending this is a normal marriage when you're never here, and when you are here, you might as well be a stranger. At the time, I figured it was just frustration talking. 15 years of military wife life catching up with her all at once. So I did what I always did. I promised things would get better, made some vague noises about requesting more stateside assignments, and went back to work assuming we'd figure it out when I got home. Except when I did get home 2 weeks later, something had changed. Marissa was different, not angry anymore, but distant, polite. Like we were roommates who happened to share a bed and a mortgage. She'd smile when I walked in a room, ask about my flight, make dinner conversation about Jordan's school and the neighbor's new fence. All perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, perfectly fucking fake. That's when I found the phone. I wasn't snooping, for the record. I was looking for jumper cables in her car because mine had decided to die in the Walmart parking lot like some kind of automotive drama queen. The phone was wedged under the driver's seat, wrapped in a McDonald's napkin like someone had been trying to hide it. Not her regular phone. This was a cheap burner, the kind you pick up at gas stations when you don't want certain conversations showing up on your regular bill. The smart play would have been to confront her right then and there. Ask her what the hell she was doing with a secret phone and who she was talking to that required that level of operational security. But I didn't. Know why? Because I was a coward. Because some part of me already knew the answer, and I wasn't ready to deal with whatever shitstorm would follow. Instead, I did what I do best. I gathered intelligence. Wrote down the number from the last incoming call, ran it through some resources I probably shouldn't have had access to for personal use. The number belonged to Patrick Morrison, registered to an address in the nice part of town where people drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. Patrick Morrison, Marissa's ex-husband. The guy she divorced before we met because he was controlling and obsessed with money and incapable of understanding what real love looked like. At least, that's what she'd told me during those long, romantic conversations we used to have back when she actually seemed happy to see me. Apparently, Patrick had been doing pretty well for himself since the divorce. Real estate development, city council connections, the kind of local influence that came with campaign contributions and country club memberships. The kind of guy who could make problems disappear or create new ones, depending on what served his interests. And he'd been talking to my wife. Late at night. For months. The calls always came when I was deployed, never when I was home. Long conversations, sometimes lasting an hour or more. And judging by the timing, they'd started right around the time Marissa had her little breakdown about our marriage being a sham. I should have confronted her then. Should have laid the evidence on the kitchen table and demanded an explanation. Should have asked her what the hell she thought she was doing, sneaking around with her ex-husband while I was out risking my ass to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. But I didn't, because by then, I'd already started to suspect that the conversation wouldn't go the way I wanted it to. Because some part of me had started to wonder if maybe she had a point about our marriage being broken. Because 15 years of trying to balance classified work with family life had taught me that sometimes the best intelligence is the kind you sit on until you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. So I put the phone back where I found it, finished getting those jumper cables, and went home to have dinner with my wife and son like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just discovered that my marriage had more secrets than a CIA black site. Looking back now, from the luxury of a jail cell that smelled like industrial disinfectant and crushed dreams, I could see the pattern. The late-night headaches that sent Marissa to bed early. The sudden interest in taking Jordan to visit his grandfather more often. The way she'd encourage me to take assignments, practically pushing me out the door when opportunities came up. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. And Patrick Morrison, the ex-husband with the money and the connections and the apparent inability to let go of what used to be his, had been helping her every step of the way. The question wasn't whether they'd killed Harold Brennan together. The question was why they'd needed him dead in the first place, and why framing me for it was worth the risk of everything falling apart. But I was starting to get some ideas about that too. And none of them were going to end well for the happy couple. Here's something they don't teach you in marriage counseling. When your wife frames you for murder, it really helps to have friends who know how to make people disappear. Not that I was planning anything dramatic, mind you. But when you've spent 15 years pulling certain people's asses out of various international fires, those people tend to remember the favor. And right about now, I needed all the favors I could get. The thing about guys like me is that we don't make friends the normal way. We don't bond over fantasy football or complain about our lawn mowers over a beer. We make friends by bleeding together, by trusting each other with our lives in situations where trust isn't just important. It's the difference between going home to your family and becoming a statistic in some classified after-action report. I'd saved Tommy Rodriguez's life in Syria when he took shrapnel in a firefight that officially never happened. He'd returned the favor in Afghanistan when my position got overrun and I needed someone to call in air support that would have made the evening news if anyone had been allowed to report on it. Mike owed me for Baghdad. I owed Sarah Martinez for that clusterfuck in Eastern Europe, and we all owed Danny Murphy for pretty much everything because the man was a walking miracle when it came to getting people out of impossible situations. These weren't drinking buddies or weekend golf partners. These were the kind of people who understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't exactly legal, and sometimes helping a friend meant operating in the gray areas where official channels feared to tread. The kind of people who'd gotten very good at making problems go away quietly and efficiently, without bothering the bureaucrats who preferred their paperwork to stay clean. So when word got out that David Kane, solid operator, stand-up guy, saved more lives than he'd taken, which was saying something in our line of work, had been arrested for murdering his father-in-law in a suburban driveway, certain people started asking questions. Not the official kind of questions that involve paperwork and congressional oversight. The other kind. The kind that got answered in cash payments to the right people and favors called in from contacts who preferred to remain unnamed. Day 2 of my extended stay at the Gray Bar Hotel, Tommy Rodriguez was having coffee with a communications technician who'd always been flexible about which phone records were and weren't available for civilian law enforcement requests. Funny how these things work out. Seems like Marissa's phone records were suddenly accessible to anyone with the right credentials and a willingness to ask nicely. The conversation went something like this. Hey, you know that Kane case everyone's talking about? His wife's been making a lot of late-night calls to her ex-husband. Like, a suspicious amount of late-night calls. The kind that might make you wonder what they've been discussing at 2 in the morning for the past 8 months. Day 3, Mike Chun was having lunch with a guy who worked security for the company that monitored traffic cameras in the suburbs where Harold Brennan had lived. Amazing how these surveillance systems work. Turns out they keep records of who drives through certain neighborhoods, especially the kind of neighborhoods where city councilmen and real estate developers live. Even more amazing how those records might show Marissa's car making multiple trips to her father's house on the night he died, including one trip that lasted exactly 17 minutes, just long enough to commit a murder and stage a crime scene. Now, I'm not saying these conversations were anything other than friendly chats between professionals who happen to work in related fields. And I'm definitely not saying that any classified resources were used for personal purposes, because that would be highly inappropriate and probably illegal. But it's funny how information has a way of flowing between people who understand the value of mutual assistance. Day 4 brought the most interesting development yet. Sarah Martinez, who'd always had a gift for financial investigations, probably because she'd spent 3 years tracking terrorist funding through shell companies that existed only on paper, had coffee with someone who worked at the bank where Patrick Morrison kept his accounts. Not the accounts he used for his legitimate real estate business, mind you. The other accounts. The ones registered to LLCs with names like Pacific Holdings and Morrison Development Trust. Turns out, Patrick had been very busy in the weeks leading up to Harold's death. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to individuals whose job descriptions were probably best left unexamined. The kind of financial activity that suggested someone was either planning a very expensive vacation or preparing to make some serious problems go away permanently. But the real kicker, the piece of information that made everything click into place like a rifle bolt sliding home, came from Danny Murphy. Danny had always been good at finding things that weren't supposed to be found, which made him invaluable when you needed to locate enemy weapons caches or terrorist safe houses. Turns out, those same skills worked pretty well for tracking domestic financial irregularities. Harold Brennan, it seemed, had been sitting on something more valuable than his antique coin collection and his opinions about kids these days. The old man had been the primary beneficiary of his late wife's life insurance policy, a substantial policy that had been sitting in trust, gathering interest, waiting for him to kick the bucket so it could pass to his only daughter. We're talking serious money here. The kind of money that could fund a very comfortable lifestyle for two people who were tired of dealing with inconvenient husbands and their messy military careers. But here's where it gets interesting. The trust had conditions. Harold couldn't just give the money to Marissa while he was alive. There were tax implications, legal restrictions, the kind of bureaucratic red tape that kept large sums of money tied up until all the proper forms were filed and all the right people had been paid their fees. However, if Harold died under certain circumstances, and if his daughter was his sole heir, and if there were no complications like estranged sons-in-law asking awkward questions about the inheritance, well, let's just say that particular trust fund would become available very quickly, with very few questions asked. So there it was, laid out like a tactical map of enemy positions. Marissa gets Harold out of the way, inherits the money, and lives happily ever after with Patrick Morrison, assuming her inconvenient husband is safely locked away for the murder she committed. Clean, simple, profitable. The kind of plan that looked brilliant on paper and would have worked perfectly if they hadn't made one critical error. They'd underestimated exactly how many people owed David Kane a favor. By day 5, my invisible allies had assembled enough evidence to sink Marissa's little conspiracy like a torpedo hitting an aircraft carrier. Phone records showing the coordination between Marissa and Patrick. Financial records showing Patrick's payments to individuals who specialized in making problems disappear. Surveillance footage showing Marissa's car at the scene during the window when Harold died. Bank records showing large transfers from Patrick's accounts to Marissa's, payments that just happened to coincide with her father's death. It was beautiful work, the kind of comprehensive intelligence operation that would have made the CIA proud. Except this operation was being run by people who didn't have to worry about congressional oversight or public accountability. People who understood that sometimes justice worked better when it operated outside official channels. The best part? None of this evidence would ever be traced back to its sources. These weren't official investigations or legitimate law enforcement activities. This was information that had simply become available through the kind of coincidences that happen when the right people ask the right questions of the right individuals at the right time. My friends weren't just gathering intelligence, though. They were positioning themselves for the endgame. Because when you're dealing with people who think they can frame a decorated soldier for murder and walk away with a fortune in blood money, you don't just expose them. You destroy them. Completely. Permanently. In ways that make sure they never get the chance to try this shit again. And that's exactly what was about to happen. Because Marissa and Patrick were about to learn that some favors come with interest, and the bill was almost due. You want to know what real heartbreak feels like? It's not the dramatic chest-clutching, fall-to-your-knees bullshit they show in the movies. It's quieter than that. More insidious. It's the slow realization that the person you die for has been weaponized against you by someone who understands exactly how to twist a knife in the one place you can't defend. Jordan, my boy. My 12-year-old son who used to think I was invincible, who used to run to the door every time I came home from a deployment like I was returning from some grand adventure instead of places where people tried to kill me for a living. The kid who'd beg me to tell him stories about work stuff, even though I could never give him the details he wanted. He'd settle for sanitized versions where the bad guys always lost and dad always came home safe, because that's what kids need to believe about their fathers. Except now that same kid was sitting in a courtroom, telling perfect strangers that he'd watched me murder his grandfather in cold blood. And the worst part? He believed every word he was saying. I'd seen this kind of manipulation before, in places where people did very bad things to extract information from very unwilling sources. Psychological conditioning, memory implantation, the kind of mental warfare that left victims convinced that black was white and up was down. But seeing it done to enemy combatants was one thing. Seeing it done to your own child by your own wife. That was a special kind of evil that made waterboarding look like a spa treatment. The thing about kids Jordan's age is that their brains are still developing, still figuring out the difference between memory and imagination, between what really happened and what they've been told happened. It's why eyewitness testimony from children is usually worthless in court, not because kids lie, but because they're incredibly susceptible to suggestion. Tell them something happened often enough, with enough detail and conviction, and their brains will helpfully fill in the gaps until they have a complete, vivid memory of an event that never occurred. Marissa knew this. Hell, she'd probably researched it, maybe even consulted with professionals who specialized in this kind of psychological manipulation. Because what she'd done to Jordan wasn't amateur hour. This was sophisticated, methodical, and absolutely fucking ruthless. I could see the timeline now, playing out in my head like a tactical briefing. She'd started months ago, probably right around the time she'd reconnected with Patrick Morrison. Little comments here and there about how Daddy seemed different when he came home from work. How he looked angry sometimes, violent even. How maybe Jordan should be careful around Daddy because people who did the kind of work Daddy did sometimes brought that violence home with them. Plant the seeds first. Make the kid start questioning what he knew about his father. Create doubt, uncertainty, fear. Then build on that foundation with more specific suggestions. Remember that time Daddy raised his voice? That wasn't just normal frustration. That was dangerous anger. Remember that time Daddy came home late and looked tired? That wasn't exhaustion from a difficult mission. That was guilt from doing something terrible. By the time she was ready to implant the actual false memory, Jordan's mind had been primed to accept it. His trust in his father had been systematically eroded, replaced with suspicion and fear. And when Mommy sat him down and helped him remember what he'd seen that night, Daddy fighting with Grandpa Harold, Daddy pushing him, Daddy making that shushing gesture to keep Jordan quiet. His brain just accepted it as another piece of evidence that confirmed what he'd already been conditioned to believe. The sick genius of it was that Jordan wasn't lying. In his mind, he really had witnessed his father commit murder. He could describe the scene in perfect detail because his brain had constructed a complete memory based on the suggestions his mother had carefully planted. He could pass any lie detector test, could convince any jury, could look his own father in the eye and swear on his life that what he was saying was true. Because to him, it was true. I thought about all the nights I'd tucked him into bed, all the stories I'd told him, all the times he'd asked me if I was ever scared when I was away. Nah, buddy, I'd always tell him. Good guys don't get scared. We just get careful. And he'd smile and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that his dad was one of the good guys, that he fought monsters and won every time. Now that same kid thought I was the monster. The psychological damage this would cause him was probably irreversible. Even if the truth came out, even if Marissa's lies were exposed and her conspiracy unraveled, Jordan would spend the rest of his life dealing with the fact that he'd been manipulated into betraying his own father. The guilt, the confusion, the fundamental inability to trust his own memories. It would fuck him up in ways that years of therapy might not be able to fix. And Marissa had done this to him. Not just to me, but to him. Her own son. She'd taken a 12-year-old boy who trusted her completely and turned him into a weapon against his father, knowing full well that the psychological shrapnel would destroy his ability to form healthy relationships for the rest of his life. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Marissa wasn't just greedy or vindictive or desperate for a new life with her ex-husband. She was genuinely, clinically sociopathic. The kind of person who could sacrifice her own child's mental health without a moment's hesitation if it served her purposes. The kind of person who could look at a 12-year-old boy and see nothing but a tool to be used and discarded. I'd lived with this woman for 15 years. I'd shared a bed with her, trusted her with my life, given her a son. And I'd never seen what she really was underneath the suburban mom facade. Either she was that good at hiding her true nature, or I'd been that blind to the signs. Probably both. The really fucked up part was that Jordan still loved her. Even as she was systematically destroying his relationship with his father, even as she was programming him to become an unwitting accomplice to murder, he still saw her as the person who took care of him, who made his lunches and drove him to soccer practice and kissed his scraped knees. In his mind, she was the good parent, the safe parent, the one who'd never hurt him. Which meant that when the truth finally came out, and it would come out, because my invisible allies were thorough as hell, Jordan would lose both parents at once. He'd realized that his father wasn't a murderer, but he'd also realized that his mother was a manipulative psychopath who'd used him as a weapon. The betrayal would hit him from both sides, and there wouldn't be anyone left for him to trust. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done to me. It would have been easier that way, cleaner. Just write him off as another casualty of Marissa's war against me and move on with whatever was left of my life. But I couldn't do it, because every time I looked at him sitting in that courtroom, pale and scared, and trying so hard to be brave while he destroyed his father with words that weren't his own, all I could see was the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read him stories about knights and dragons. He was a victim too. Maybe the biggest victim of all, because he'd have to live with the consequences of what he'd been made to do long after Marissa and Patrick were just unpleasant memories. The question was whether there'd be anything left of my son to save when this was all over, or whether Marissa had broken him so completely that he'd never be able to trust anyone again, including himself. Either way, she was going to pay for what she'd done to him. That wasn't negotiable. Chapter 7, letting the trap close. You know what separates a good soldier from a great one? Patience. The ability to sit still while everything around you goes to hell. To let your enemies think they're winning while you position yourself for the kill shot. It's the difference between reactive tactics and strategic warfare, between surviving the battle and winning the war. So when they dragged me into that courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that made me look like a traffic cone with anger management issues, I did something that probably confused the hell out of everyone watching. Absolutely nothing. No dramatic protests of innocence, no desperate attempts to expose the truth, no impassioned speeches about being framed by my vindictive wife. I just sat there, calm as a monk on Xanax, and let Marissa's little theater production play out exactly the way she'd rehearsed it. The courtroom was one of those wood-paneled affairs that was supposed to inspire confidence in the American justice system, but mostly just reminded you that the whole thing was an elaborate performance with costumes and scripts and an audience that pretended to believe what they were seeing. Judge Harrison looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe playing golf or having a colonoscopy, but he was stuck presiding over what everybody assumed was going to be an open and shut case of domestic violence gone wrong. My public defender was a kid fresh out of law school who looked like he'd been told he was defending Jeffrey Dahmer's uglier brother. Every time he glanced at me, his expression screamed, "Please don't eat me," which was both hilarious and depressing. The prosecution had drawn District Attorney Margaret Phelps, a woman who'd built her career on being tougher than a $2 steak and twice as unforgiving. She had the kind of reputation that made defense attorneys wake up in cold sweats and career criminals consider honest employment. But the real show was happening at the plaintiff's table. Marissa had dressed for the part like she was auditioning for the role of grieving daughter in a Lifetime movie about family tragedy. Conservative black dress, minimal makeup that somehow made her look both devastated and dignified, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she was too overwhelmed by grief to worry about vanity. She'd even managed to develop a subtle tremor in her hands that appeared whenever she had to look in my direction. Patrick Morrison sat behind her in the gallery, playing the part of the concerned friend who just happened to be there for moral support. He'd gone for the successful businessman who's definitely not fucking the defendant's wife. Look, expensive suit, tasteful tie, just the right amount of gray at his temples to suggest wisdom and stability. Every so often, he'd lean forward to whisper something comforting in Marissa's ear, and she'd nod gratefully like he was her only anchor in a storm of tragedy and betrayal. Jordan sat beside his mother, looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal from a drunk dentist. The kid had clearly been coached within an inch of his life, sitting up straight, hands folded in his lap, making appropriate eye contact with the jury, but not so much that he seemed rehearsed. Marissa kept a protective hand on his shoulder, the picture of a mother shielding her traumatized child from the monster who destroyed their family. It was beautiful work, really. If I hadn't known it was all bullshit, I might have been impressed by the attention to detail. Every gesture, every expression, every carefully timed tear, it all added up to a compelling narrative about a violent husband who'd finally snapped and killed his own father-in-law in a fit of rage. The prosecution's opening statement hit all the right notes. Phelps painted me as a dangerous man trained to kill, someone who'd brought the violence of my military career home with him. She talked about the strain of long deployments, the psychological toll of classified work, the way combat veterans sometimes struggled to readjust to civilian life. It was textbook character assassination, designed to make the jury see me not as a decorated soldier, but as a ticking time bomb who'd finally exploded. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, gesturing toward me like I was a particularly venomous snake. "David Kane is a man who has spent years learning how to kill efficiently and without remorse. A man whose job required him to compartmentalize violence, to separate his emotions from his actions. And when that violence finally came home, when the pressure of maintaining two separate lives became too much, Harold Brennan paid the ultimate price." She called it the warrior's curse, the idea that men like me were fundamentally broken by our experiences, that we were walking time bombs who could snap at any moment and turn our training against innocent civilians. It was insulting as hell, but it was also effective. I could see the jury buying it, see them looking at me with that mixture of fear and disgust that people reserve for rabid animals and politicians. When they called Marissa to the stand, she played her role flawlessly, voice breaking at just the right moments, tears flowing on cue, body language that screamed, "Victim of domestic abuse." She talked about how I'd changed over the years, how I'd become distant and angry, how she'd started to fear for her safety in Jordan's. "He was different when he came back from his last deployment," she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that somehow never got too soggy to be effective. "Angrier, more violent. He'd have these episodes where he'd just disappear into himself, like he was back wherever they'd sent him. It was masterful fiction. She took every normal reaction to the stress of classified work, the need for privacy, the difficulty in transitioning between operational mindsets and family life, the occasional moments of distraction when you're processing classified information you can't discuss, and reframed them as signs of psychological instability and potential violence. When they asked her about the night Harold died, her performance reached Oscar-worthy levels. She described getting a panicked phone call from Jordan, rushing over to find her father dead and her husband standing over the body. She talked about the blood, the way I'd looked at her with cold, empty eyes, the threats I'd allegedly made about what would happen if she told anyone what she'd seen. The jury ate it up like free pizza at a college dorm. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, half of them were looking at me like I was personally responsible for every unsolved murder in the tri-state area. Jordan's testimony was even more devastating because it came across as completely innocent. No coaching, no agenda, just a traumatized 12-year-old boy bravely telling the truth about the night his father became a monster. He described the scene with the kind of vivid detail that could only come from genuine memory, because in his mind, that's exactly what it was. The kid even managed to cry at the right moments. Not the forced tears of an adult performer, but the real, heartbreaking sobs of a child who believed he was doing the right thing by telling the truth about his father's crime. It was simultaneously the most convincing testimony I'd ever heard and the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever witnessed. Through it all, I sat perfectly still. Didn't object, didn't react, didn't give them any ammunition to support their narrative about my violent tendencies. My lawyer kept shooting me confused looks, probably wondering why his client wasn't helping with his own defense. The jury kept stealing glances in my direction, looking for signs of the monster they'd been told I was. And Marissa? She kept watching me too, but her expression was different. Cautious, like she couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't playing my part in her drama. She'd expected me to fight back, to rage against the accusations, to give her more evidence of my supposedly violent nature. Instead, she got nothing. Just calm, patient silence from a man who was supposed to be falling apart under the weight of his own guilt. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't just sitting there taking it. I was studying her, cataloging every tell, every micro-expression, every moment when the mask slipped just a fraction. Because while she was busy performing for the jury, she was also revealing things about herself that she probably didn't realize. The way she glanced at Patrick after particularly effective moments in her testimony. The way her breathing changed when she lied versus when she told the truth. The way she unconsciously touched her earring when she was reciting memorized lines versus speaking spontaneously. She thought she was watching me break. Instead, she was showing me exactly how she'd constructed her lies and where the weak points were in her performance. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully planned emotion was giving me intelligence I could use when the time came to destroy her. Because that time was coming. Soon. And when it did, she was going to learn that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. 10 days. That's how long it took for Marissa's little Broadway production to reach its grand finale. And I have to say, she'd put on one hell of a show. The prosecution had paraded witness after witness to the stand. Neighbors who testified about my suspicious behavior, co-workers who described my violent tendencies, even Jordan's soccer coach who swore I'd once looked at him in a threatening manner during a parent-teacher conference. It was like watching a masterclass in character assassination, each testimony carefully designed to paint me as a dangerous sociopath who'd finally snapped and murdered his own father-in-law in cold blood. The defense my court-appointed lawyer had mounted was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. Kid meant well, bless his heart, but he was working with nothing. No alibi I could verify without exposing classified operations. No witnesses who could testify to my whereabouts. No evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Every time he tried to poke holes in their story, they'd patch it up with another witness or another piece of circumstantial evidence that made me look guiltier than a fox in a henhouse full of dead chickens. Judge Harrison had clearly made up his mind somewhere around day 3. You could see it in the way he looked at me. Not like a man presumed innocent until proven guilty, but like a rabid dog that needed to be put down for the safety of decent society. His questions to the defense were perfunctory. His rulings consistently favored the prosecution, and his body language screamed that he was just going through the motions until he could slam down his gavel and sentence me to life without parole. The jury was even more obvious. 12 good citizens of this fine community, and every single one of them had bought Marissa's performance hook, line, and sinker. The soccer mom in seat 4 kept shooting me disgusted looks like I'd personally kicked her dog. The retired mechanic in seat 7 actually recoiled when I glanced in his direction. Even the college kid in seat 2, who probably thought he was too cool to be swayed by emotional manipulation, was nodding along with every word of the prosecution's closing argument. And why wouldn't they? The story made perfect sense. Troubled veteran with anger issues finally loses control and kills his wife's father in a domestic dispute gone wrong. Wife and child witness the aftermath, traumatized but brave enough to testify against the monster they trusted. It was neat, clean, and emotionally satisfying in the way that real life rarely is. The kind of story that makes people feel good about their ability to spot the bad guys and do the right thing. Marissa had outdone herself during the closing arguments. When the prosecution called her back to the stand for one final statement, she delivered a performance that would have made Meryl Streep weep with envy. Voice trembling with barely controlled emotion, eyes brimming with tears that somehow never quite fell, she looked directly at the jury and spoke from the heart about the man she'd once loved and the monster he'd become. "I keep thinking about the David I married," she said, her voice cracking at exactly the right moment. "The man who used to read bedtime stories to Jordan, who would hold me when I had nightmares, who promised to protect our family no matter what. I keep wondering when that man disappeared and this stranger took his place." She paused, letting that sink in, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture that looked spontaneous but had probably been practiced in front of a mirror. "I know some of you are thinking that I should have seen the signs, that I should have protected my son from his own father. And you're right. I failed Jordan that night. I failed my father. I failed to recognize that the man I'd been sharing a bed with for 15 years was capable of such violence." The tears finally came then, rolling down her cheeks with perfect timing. "But I won't fail them again. I won't let fear or misplaced loyalty prevent me from telling the truth about what happened that night. My father is dead because I was too blind to see what David had become, too naive to believe that the man who swore to love and protect our family could be the same man who would murder my father in cold blood." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Hell, even my own lawyer looked like he was ready to convict me himself. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, the kind of testimony that doesn't just convince a jury of your guilt. It makes them feel good about sending you away for the rest of your natural life. The prosecution's closing argument was almost anticlimactic after Marissa's performance. District Attorney Phelps simply laid out the facts as they'd been presented. Motive, opportunity, witness testimony, physical evidence. She reminded the jury that David Cain was a trained killer, a man who'd spent years learning how to take lives efficiently and without remorse. She painted a picture of escalating domestic violence, of a marriage under strain, of a man whose military training had finally turned against innocent civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, she concluded, her voice ringing with righteous authority, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. David Cain murdered Harold Brennan in cold blood, and then he tried to intimidate the only witnesses to his crime, his own wife and son. This is not a case about the difficulties of military service or the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. This is a case about murder, pure and simple. And justice demands that you find the defendant guilty on all charges. My lawyer's closing argument was a valiant effort, considering he was working with roughly the same amount of evidence as a climate change denier at a science convention. He talked about reasonable doubt, about the burden of proof, about the dangers of convicting a man based on circumstantial evidence and emotional testimony. But you could see he didn't believe a word of it himself. His heart wasn't in it because his head had already accepted that his client was guilty as hell and headed for a life sentence. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were textbook perfect, explaining their duty, outlining the charges, reminding them about the standard of proof required for a conviction. But his tone made it clear that he expected them to come back with a guilty verdict, probably sometime before lunch if they didn't waste too much time on unnecessary deliberation. That's when he asked the question that every defendant dreads and every prosecutor loves. Mr. Cain, before this court proceeds to jury deliberation, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the court? This was my moment. The last chance to make my case, to protest my innocence, to beg for mercy or understanding or some kind of consideration from 12 people who'd already made up their minds that I was a cold-blooded killer. Every defendant in the history of American jurisprudence had used this opportunity to make one final plea for their freedom, their life, their chance to prove their innocence. Instead, I did something that nobody in that courtroom was expecting. I reached into the folder my lawyer had placed in front of me, the same folder he'd been using to take notes throughout the trial, the same folder that contained copies of all the evidence the prosecution had presented against me. But tucked inside that folder, invisible to everyone except me, was a single manila envelope, sealed, unmarked, containing information that was going to turn this entire proceeding upside down and inside out. I didn't say a word, didn't stand up, didn't address the jury, didn't make any kind of speech about my innocence or my service to my country or the injustice of what was happening to me. I simply slid that envelope across the table to Judge Harrison and waited. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the air conditioning humming overhead, someone's stomach growling in the gallery. Everyone was staring at me, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. Marissa's eyes had gone wide with something that might have been confusion or might have been the first hint of real fear she'd shown since this whole thing started. Judge Harrison looked at the envelope like it might contain anthrax or a bomb or some other unpleasant surprise. His expression suggested that he was really not in the mood for whatever dramatic revelation I thought I was about to spring on his courtroom. But judicial procedure demanded that he open it. So he picked up his letter opener and slit the seal with the resigned air of a man who just wanted to get through the rest of his day without any more complications. He unfolded the papers inside, started reading, and then something very interesting happened to his face. The blood drained out of it like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again as he scanned the documents. His hands actually started shaking as he turned to the second page, then the third, then back to the first like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The courtroom watched this transformation with growing unease. Marissa was gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table hard enough to leave marks. Patrick Morrison had gone pale in the gallery, his businessman's composure cracking around the edges. Even the bailiff was starting to look nervous, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he looked at Marissa, at Patrick, at the jury, at the packed gallery full of people who'd come to watch a monster get his comeuppance. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Something that suggested the nice, orderly trial they'd all been enjoying was about to take a hard left turn into territory nobody had been expecting. "Bailiff," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "Lock the doors. No one leaves this courtroom." The bailiff hesitated for just a second, clearly confused by the unprecedented order. But judges don't make requests like that lightly, and the tone in Harrison's voice suggested that this wasn't the time for questions or hesitation. The sound of the locks engaging echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. Suddenly, the comfortable theater of American justice had transformed into something else entirely. Something that felt more like a trap that had just snapped shut around everyone inside. Marissa was no longer the grieving widow seeking justice for her murdered father. She was a woman who'd just realized that her carefully constructed house of lies might be about to collapse around her ears. And me? I was still sitting quietly at the defendant's table, my hands folded in my lap, waiting to see what would happen when 10 days of lies finally met 30 seconds of truth. You know that moment in action movies when the cavalry shows up at exactly the right time, riding over the hill with flags flying and trumpets blaring? Yeah, this wasn't that. This was better. This was surgical precision delivered by people who understood that the best operations are the ones nobody sees coming until it's already over and the bodies are being counted. The back doors of the courtroom didn't burst open so much as they simply opened, quiet as a whisper, professional as a tax audit. No dramatic entrance, no movie-style theatrics. Just 5 men in plain suits walking in like they belonged there, like they'd been invited to this particular party and were only slightly late because of traffic. The kind of men who looked unremarkable until you noticed the way they moved, the way their eyes cataloged every face in the room, the way their hands stayed loose and ready at their sides. I recognized the lead man immediately. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI, but the kind of FBI that didn't advertise their presence on business cards or government websites. The kind that handled situations too sensitive for regular law enforcement, too complicated for standard procedure, too dangerous for anyone who wasn't trained to operate in the gray areas where official policy met operational necessity. We'd worked together before, in places that didn't exist and on missions that never happened. Webb's eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw the faintest hint of a nod. Not acknowledgement exactly, more like confirmation. Like he was letting me know that the favor I'd called in had been received, processed, and was now being executed with the kind of efficiency that made the American intelligence community the envy of dictators and terrorists worldwide. Judge Harrison was still staring at the papers in the envelope, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that couldn't decide which jackpot to pay out. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and what looked suspiciously like the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've been sitting in a courtroom full of lies for 10 days without knowing it. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard in every corner of the room. "Agent Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the interruption, but we have some urgent business to conduct." Marissa had gone completely still at the plaintiff's table, like a deer that's just spotted the headlights bearing down on it. Her performance mask had finally slipped, revealing something underneath that looked a lot more like genuine terror than the grief she'd been selling for the past week and a half. Her eyes were darting between Webb and his team, between the locked doors and the envelope still clutched in Judge Harrison's shaking hands. Patrick Morrison was trying to stand up in the gallery, probably thinking he could bluff his way out of whatever was about to happen. That's what civilian criminals always think, that they can talk their way out of trouble, charm their way past consequences, lawyer their way around inconvenient facts. It's almost adorable, in the same way that a house cat thinking it can take on a mountain lion is adorable. "Excuse me," Patrick said, his voice carrying that entitled tone that rich men use when they think their money makes them untouchable. "But this is highly irregular. I demand to know what authority you have to." Webb cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging rhino. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to sit down and remain quiet. You'll have plenty of opportunities to talk very soon." The threat in those words wasn't subtle. It was the kind of promise that came with federal backing and the full weight of resources that could make people disappear into the American justice system for decades at a time. Patrick sat down so fast you'd have thought his legs had been cut out from under him. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out about an octave higher than his usual courtroom baritone. "Agent Webb, what exactly is going on here? What's in this envelope?" "Evidence, Your Honor. The kind of evidence that tends to change the entire nature of a case." Webb gestured to one of his team, a woman who looked like she could bench press a small car and probably had at some point in her career. "Agent Martinez here has been conducting a parallel investigation into the death of Harold Brennan. Turns out there were some discrepancies in the official police report that warranted federal attention." Agent Martinez stepped forward, pulling out a tablet that probably contained more classified information than most small countries had access to. Her voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of the emotion that had been driving this trial for the past 10 days. "Your Honor, we have surveillance footage from multiple sources showing Mrs. Kane's vehicle at the victim's residence on 3 separate occasions during the time frame when Mr. Brennan was killed. We also have phone records indicating coordination between Mrs. Kane and Mr. Morrison, including several calls made immediately before and after the victim's death." The jury was starting to look like they'd been hit with a collective stun gun. These were the same 12 people who'd been convinced beyond reasonable doubt that David Kane was a cold-blooded killer, and now they were being told that maybe, just maybe, they'd been watching the wrong movie for the past week and a half. Marissa finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "This is insane. I don't know what kind of conspiracy you're trying to construct here, but my husband killed my father. Jordan saw it happen. I saw the aftermath. This is all some kind of elaborate cover-up to protect a military." "Ma'am," Webb interrupted, and his tone suggested that he'd heard enough bullshit for one afternoon. "I'm going to stop you right there. Because in about 30 seconds, you're going to be placed under arrest, and anything you say from this point forward is going to be used against you in federal court." He nodded to Agent Martinez, who began reading from her tablet with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from delivering bad news to bad people on a regular basis. "We have financial records showing large payments from Mr. Morrison to several individuals with extensive criminal records, payments that coincide exactly with the timeline of Mr. Brennan's death. We have testimony from one of those individuals detailing his role in staging the crime scene to implicate Mr. Kane." The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Marissa was shaking now, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that was dismantling her entire story piece by piece. Patrick Morrison looked like he was having some kind of cardiac episode, his face cycling through shades of red and purple that probably weren't medically advisable. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "we have evidence that Mrs. Kane systematically manipulated her son's testimony through a process of psychological conditioning that amounts to child abuse under federal statutes. The boy's statement was not based on actual memory, but on implanted false recollections created through months of careful manipulation." Jordan looked confused, scared, like he was finally starting to understand that something was very wrong with the story he'd been telling. The kid was 12, not stupid, and you could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to process the idea that his mother had been lying to him, using him, turning him into a weapon against his own father. That's when Marissa made her last, desperate play. She lunged toward Jordan, probably thinking she could use him as some kind of human shield or emotional leverage. "Jordan, baby, don't listen to them. They're lying. Daddy hurt Grandpa Harold, remember? We saw it together, remember? She never made it within 3 feet of him." Agent Martinez moved with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from years of tactical training, intercepting Marissa's desperate grab and putting her on the ground in about 2 seconds flat. Professional, controlled, completely without drama or unnecessary violence. "Marissa Kane," Martinez said, pulling out handcuffs that looked like they'd seen plenty of use. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, perjury, obstruction of justice, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent, though frankly, that would be the smartest thing you've done in months." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I'd heard in my entire life. Better than any symphony, any rock concert, any victory song that had ever been written. It was the sound of justice finally catching up with someone who'd thought they were clever enough to outsmart the system. Patrick Morrison was trying to blend into the gallery seating like a chameleon with commitment issues, but Webb was already moving in his direction with the patient, methodical approach of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Mr. Morrison, Webb said conversationally. We also have some questions for you. Seems like your financial records show some very interesting patterns over the past few months. Large cash withdrawals, payments to individuals with interesting skill sets, wire transfers to offshore accounts. The kind of activity that makes federal investigators very curious about your business practices. Patrick tried to run. Actually tried to make a break for the doors like this was some kind of action movie, and he was the plucky protagonist who was going to escape at the last minute through a combination of luck and determination. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. He made it about 6 steps before one of Webb's team, a guy who looked like he could probably tackle a freight train and win. Put him down with the kind of textbook takedown they probably show in training videos at Quantico. Professional, efficient, completely unnecessary for anyone watching to worry about excessive force complaints. Patrick Morrison, the agent said, pulling Morrison's face off the courtroom floor and reaching for his own set of handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and about 15 different financial crimes that are going to keep federal prosecutors busy for the next several years. The courtroom had gone dead silent except for the sound of Marissa's sobbing and Patrick Morrison's muffled protests about lawyers and constitutional rights, and how this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Judge Harrison was still clutching the envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe, his eyes moving between the federal agents and the 2 people who'd just been arrested in his courtroom. Jordan was crying now, but not the fake tears his mother had taught him to produce on command. These were real tears, the kind that come from a 12-year-old boy finally understanding that everything he'd believed about his family, his father, his entire world, had been built on lies that were now crumbling around him. And me? I was still sitting at the defendant's table, watching my wife and her lover get arrested for the murder they'd tried to pin on me, feeling something that was part relief, part satisfaction, and part anger that it had taken this long for the truth to finally surface. Webb walked over to my table, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing just a hint of the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Sorry it took so long, Kane. Had to make sure we had everything buttoned up tight before we moved. Couldn't risk any of this falling apart on technicalities. I nodded, understanding completely. When you're taking down a conspiracy this elaborate, you don't get second chances. You get everything right the first time, or you watch the bad guys walk away to try again with someone else. Appreciate the assist, I said quietly. I owe you one. Webb smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since he walked into the courtroom. Actually, Kane, I think we're even now. Maybe even a little ahead. Judge Harrison dismissed my case in 43 seconds flat. I know because I counted, watching the second hand on the courtroom clock tick away the final moments of the biggest clusterfuck of my professional life. 43 seconds to undo 10 days of lies, manipulation, and character assassination. 43 seconds to transform me from convicted murderer back to decorated soldier with a really shitty taste in women. The gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish reading. All charges dismissed, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just learned that his courtroom had been turned into a stage for an elaborate con game. Mr. Kane, you're free to go, and the court apologizes for this miscarriage of justice. An apology? Like that was supposed to make up for 10 days in county lockup and the rest of my life knowing that my own son had been programmed to believe I was a murderer. The social workers moved fast after that, swooping in with their clipboards and their concerned expressions and their theories about child psychology. They wanted to reunite me with Jordan, kept talking about healing the family unit and rebuilding trust, like this was some kind of fucking Hallmark movie where everything gets tied up with a neat little bow in the final 5 minutes. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in my son's eyes when Marcus had explained how his memories had been manipulated, when he'd realized that everything he thought he remembered about that night was just software his mother had installed in his 12-year-old brain. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal with family counseling and awkward weekend visits. He'll come around, the social worker insisted, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. Children are resilient. With time and proper therapy. I declined, politely but firmly. Because some things can't be fixed, and some relationships can't survive that kind of fundamental violation of trust. Jordan would spend years trying to separate his real memories from the false ones Marissa had implanted. The last thing he needed was the constant reminder that his testimony had almost destroyed his father's life. Maybe someday, when he was older, when he'd processed what had been done to him, we could try again. But not now. Not when every time he looked at me, he'd remember the father he'd been taught to fear. That night, I returned to an empty house that felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. Marissa's coffee mug was still in the sink. Jordan's homework was scattered across the kitchen table. The family photos on the mantel showed 3 people who'd never actually been a family, just actors playing roles they'd never fully understood. I stood in the doorway of Jordan's room for a long time, looking at the action figures and the unmade bed and the poster of some superhero whose powers included always doing the right thing. 12 years old, and he'd already learned that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who'll hurt you deepest. The silence in that house was absolute. No Marissa humming off-key in the kitchen. No Jordan's video games bleeping from the living room. No sounds of normal family life that had always been more performance than reality anyway. People think revenge is loud. They think it's about explosions and dramatic confrontations and speeches about justice being served. But real revenge? Real revenge is the sound of a door locking behind someone who thought they'd already escaped. It's the quiet satisfaction of watching a carefully constructed lie collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Marissa and Patrick were looking at serious federal time. The kind of sentences that would keep them busy until their hair turned gray and their joints started creaking. Jordan was safe, in therapy, learning to trust his own memories again. And me? I was free, vindicated, and completely alone in a house that had never really been a home. Silence filled every corner, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt like truth.